The Wyoming wind carried more than dust that September morning. It carried the smell of dying cattle, unpaid debts, and the particular kind of desperation that settles into a man's bones when he's already lost everything that mattered. Caleb Turner stood at the fence line of what used to be a thriving ranch, counting animals he couldn't afford to feed through a winter he couldn't afford to face. 37 head left. Last year, 72. The year before his wife died, nearly 200. The math didn't work anymore. Nothing worked anymore. Boss? The voice belonged to Miguel, his only remaining ranch hand. Good man. Too loyal for his own good, really. Should have left months ago when Caleb stopped being able to pay wages on time. Water troughs dry again on the north pasture. Windmill bearings shot. Caleb didn't turn around. Just nodded. Added it to the list of things needing repair that he couldn't repair, things needing money he didn't have, problems requiring solutions that didn't exist. How much we got left in the emergency fund? Caleb already knew the answer, had known it for weeks, but saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it didn't. Miguel shifted his weight. $17. Maybe $18 if you count what's in the jar in the kitchen. $17 between survival and complete ruin. Between keeping the ranch his grandfather built and watching the bank auction it off piece by piece to men like Harrison Kemp, who'd been circling for months like a vulture that could smell death still 3 weeks out. The wolves got another calf last night, Miguel added. Found what was left of it near Willow Creek. Of course they did. Because why would anything be simple? Why would anything just stop breaking? Caleb finally turned, squinting against the morning sun. Miguel looked tired. They all looked tired. The land looked tired. Even the cattle looked tired, standing in sparse grass that barely qualified as grazing, ribs showing through hides that should have been sleek with summer fat. I'll ride out this afternoon, Caleb said. Check the fencing. Already did. It's fine. They're jumping it or going around, smart enough to find the gaps. Smart enough. Smarter than him, apparently, still trying to hold together something that wanted to fall apart. Bank examiner's coming Thursday, Miguel said quietly. Saw the notice when I picked up feed in town. Thursday. 3 days. 72 hours before some clerk with clean hands and city clothes would walk through his property making notes on a clipboard about assets and deficiencies, about whether Caleb Turner was worth the risk of extending another loan to a man who'd already failed to make good on the last one. Right, Caleb said. Just that. Nothing else to say, really. Miguel waited like he expected more. When it didn't come, he nodded slowly and headed back toward the barn, shoulders bent under the weight of problems that weren't even his to carry. Caleb stood alone at the fence line watching dust devils spin across fields that used to grow decent hay. Sarah would have known what to do. Sarah had been the practical one, the one who could stretch $1 until it screamed, who knew which creditors to pay first and which ones would wait. She'd kept ledgers that made sense, had a system for everything, could look at a struggling calf, and know exactly what it needed. But Sarah had been dead 18 months, buried under a cottonwood tree on the East Ridge where she used to sit and watch sunsets, and all her practical wisdom had died with her, leaving Caleb with a failing ranch he didn't know how to save, and a grief so heavy some mornings he could barely get out of bed. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of dust and distance. Somewhere out there, people were having normal days, normal problems. Their cattle weren't dying, their banks weren't circling, their wives weren't buried on ridges they couldn't bear to visit. Caleb pushed off the fence and headed toward the house, a sagging structure that needed paint, needed repair, needed about $1,000 of work he'd never have. Inside, dirty dishes sat in a sink he kept meaning to wash. Ledgers sprawled across the kitchen table, Sarah's old ledgers, neat and organized, and his attempts at continuing them, which looked like a child had tried to forge his father's handwriting. He'd managed to make everything worse. Not just maintain the slow decline Sarah would have fought against, but actively accelerate it through sheer incompetence at anything that didn't involve cattle or fencing. The clock on the mantel, Sarah's grandmother's clock, one of the few nice things they'd owned, read 8:47. The supply run to Clearwater Station was supposed to happen today. He'd put it off twice already, but they were out of flour, almost out of coffee, and Miguel needed tobacco if they expected him to stay another week without actually getting paid. Caleb grabbed his hat, the good one with the Montana crease Sarah had shaped for him the first year they were married, and headed out to saddle his horse. The ride to Clearwater took 90 minutes if you didn't push it. He'd be back by early afternoon, still have time to ride the north fence line before dark, still have time to look at ledgers he didn't understand and wonder how the hell a man who'd been raised on this land could fail so completely at keeping it alive. The horse, a bay gelding named Red, who'd seen better days but hadn't given up yet, stood patient in the barn while Caleb saddled him. Good horse. Steady. The kind of animal that didn't complain when the hay was thin or the workload heavy. "Just you and me still trying," Caleb muttered, cinching the girth. Red's ear flicked back, listening. Didn't judge. Didn't offer opinions. Just stood there, ready to carry whatever burden came next. They rode out under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, across land so dry the grass crunched under Red's hooves. Beautiful country, even dying. Maybe especially dying. There was something honest about it now, stripped of pretense, showing its bones. Clearwater Station appeared on the horizon around 10:30. A handful of buildings clustered around railroad tracks that connected nowhere important to nowhere else. General store, train depot, saloon, boarding house, and the courthouse where they kept records of who owed what to whom and how behind they were on paying it. Caleb tied Red outside Morrison's general store and stepped into the dim interior that smelled like leather and tobacco and the particular mustiness of dry goods that had been sitting too long waiting for customers who didn't come. "Caleb," Morrison nodded from behind the counter, didn't smile. Morrison never smiled, but he also didn't press too hard when payments ran late, which made him decent by local standards. "Need flour, coffee, tobacco, whatever credit will cover." Morrison pulled out his ledger. Everyone had ledgers, apparently. Everyone except Caleb could maintain them properly, and ran his finger down a column of numbers that probably didn't look good. "You're at $47 outstanding," Morrison said. Not accusing, just factual. "I can spot you another 10, but that's the limit. Bank's been asking questions about who I'm extending to." Of course they had. The bank asked questions about everything lately, tightening the noose one inquiry at a time. "10's fine," Caleb said. It wasn't fine. $10 of supplies wouldn't carry them through a week. But what else was there to say? Morrison gathered the items without comment, wrapped them in brown paper, tied them with string that had been used and reused until it was more knot than fiber. "Heard about the wolves," he said, not looking up. "Bad business." "Yeah. Harrison Kemp was in yesterday. Said he might be interested in buying the north section if you ever wanted to sell." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I don't." "Figured. Just passing along." Morrison slid the package across the counter. "Bank examiner's making rounds Thursday. You know that?" "I know." "Right." Morrison looked like he wanted to say something else, something probably kind or encouraging, but couldn't find the words that didn't sound like pity. So he just nodded instead, and Caleb gathered the package and stepped back into sunlight that felt too bright after the store's dimness. The train was pulling in, the afternoon eastbound, running 2 hours behind schedule as usual. A handful of passengers disembarked, stretching legs and looking around at Clearwater Station like it had personally offended them by existing. Caleb was halfway to Red when he saw her. A woman sitting alone on a bench outside the station house, perfectly still in a way that suggested she'd been sitting there for a long time. Well-dressed, city clothes that looked expensive once but now showed travel wear. A large trunk beside her, the kind people brought when they expected to stay somewhere permanently. But it was her face that stopped him. Not beautiful, not in any conventional way. Older, 40, maybe more. But there was something in how she held herself, straight back despite obvious exhaustion, eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the platform or the trains or the dusty street beyond. She looked like someone who'd just watched their entire future collapse and was still trying to decide whether to scream or set something on fire. Station Master Peterson appeared from the depot office, approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am, I'm afraid if no one's coming for you, you'll need to make other arrangements. We can't have folks camping on the benches." The woman didn't look at him. "I'm not camping. I'm deciding." "Deciding what?" "What happens next?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Small-town station master didn't have a protocol for this, clearly. "There's a boarding house down the street. Mrs. Chen runs a respectable place. I could help with your trunk." "I can manage my own trunk." "Of course, but—" "I said I can manage." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind of voice used to being listened to, used to authority that came from competence rather than volume. Peterson retreated, throwing a helpless look around the platform like someone might volunteer to solve this problem for him. His eyes landed on Caleb, widened slightly in that way people's eyes did when they wanted to ask for help but knew better than to actually do it. Caleb should have walked away, should have climbed on Red and ridden home to his failing ranch and his mountain of problems that didn't need another person's complications added to them. Instead, he found himself walking toward the bench. The woman watched his approach without expression. Up close, she looked more tired than he'd realized. Educated, clearly. Something in her posture, her diction. The way she held herself suggested years of good schools and better society. But right now, she just looked exhausted. "Station master bothering you?" Caleb asked. "Station master's doing his job." She finally looked at him directly. Sharp eyes. Intelligent. Currently containing something that might have been fury or grief or both. "I'm the one refusing to cooperate with reality." "What's reality want from you?" A bitter smile flickered and died. "To admit I've been a fool. To accept that I traveled 2,000 miles for a wedding that isn't happening. To get back on a train heading east and pretend the last 3 months of correspondence weren't a complete waste of ink." Ah, mail order bride. Except someone had apparently changed their mind, left her stranded here like damaged freight. "Who was supposed to meet you? Does it matter?" She looked away again, back at that middle distance. "Someone who decided I wasn't what they ordered. Too old, apparently. The son took one look at me stepping off the train this morning and rode back to tell his father they'd made a mistake." Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. Not surprised. He'd seen enough cruelty in his life to know people were capable of worse. But the casual viciousness of it, the public humiliation of leaving a woman stranded at a station after she'd traveled across the country, that's rough. "That's accurate," she corrected. "Rough suggests bad luck. This was deliberate." She finally looked at him again. "You're staring. Is there something you need, or are you just enjoying the local entertainment?" "Neither. Just thinking." "About what?" "Good question." What was he thinking? That she looked like someone who'd been broken by circumstances beyond her control? That he recognized that particular brand of devastation because he wore it himself most days? That two broken things sometimes... "You looking to head back east?" he asked. "I don't know what I'm looking to do." "Haven't gotten that far yet. But you're not waiting for anyone." "No, I'm definitively not waiting for anyone." Her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "Why? Are you about to offer me employment as a housekeeper? Because I should tell you, I'm educated, capable, and absolutely not interested in being rescued by some well-meaning rancher who thinks a woman alone equals an opportunity." Caleb actually smiled at that. Couldn't help it. First genuine smile in months. "No, I've got enough problems without adding complicated to the list." "Then what are you doing here?" "Hell if I know," he admitted. Seemed wrong to just walk past. They sat in silence for a moment. The train whistled, preparing to depart. Passengers reboarded. The conductor called last warnings about departure times and missed connections. "Eleanor Vance," the woman said finally, "since we're apparently having a conversation." "Caleb Turner." "Mr. Turner?" She nodded slightly, formal even in disaster. "I appreciate the concern, but I assure you I'm quite capable of solving my own problems." "Didn't say you weren't." "You were thinking it." "I was thinking you looked like someone who'd been dealt a bad hand by people who should have known better." "And that inspired you to... what? Offer sympathy?" "Something like that." Eleanor studied him with those sharp, assessing eyes. "You're terrible at sympathy. Has anyone ever told you that?" "My wife used to mention it." "Used to?" "She died 18 months ago." The sharpness in Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Not pity, something closer to recognition. "I'm sorry." "So am I." Caleb stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "Boarding house is down the street. Mrs. Chen's decent. Doesn't overcharge, doesn't ask too many questions." "Thank you." He was turning to leave when she spoke again. "Mr. Turner?" "Yeah?" "Why did you really stop? The truth this time?" Caleb considered the question, considered all the easy lies he could tell. Finally settled on something closer to honesty. "Because you looked like I feel most days." Figured at minimum that was worth acknowledging. He left her there on the bench, trunk beside her, future uncertain. Climbed on Red and headed back toward the ranch, the sun climbing toward noon, the temperature rising into the kind of heat that made everything shimmer and bend. By the time he reached home, Miguel had already heard the story, small towns being what they were, gossip traveling faster than horses. "True about the bride?" Miguel asked, taking Red's reins. "Seems to be. That's cold." "Yeah." "She got anywhere to go?" "Boarding house, I expect." Miguel nodded slowly, that particular nod that meant he was thinking something, but trying to decide whether to say it. "Could use help with the books," he finally offered. "You know, if she was looking for work, educated woman and all." Caleb shot him a look. "We can't afford to pay the help we've got. Just saying, woman like that stranded here might consider room and board if the alternative's heading back to wherever she came from with her tail between her legs. We're not hiring." "Didn't say hire, said help." Miguel headed toward the barn, leading Red. Just a thought. But the thought stuck, irritating as a burr, all through the afternoon, while Caleb rode the north fence line, finding gaps the wolves were using, all through the evening, while he sat at the kitchen table staring at ledgers that still didn't make sense, all through the night while he lay awake listening to wind rattle windows that needed repair. A woman educated enough to manage correspondence across 2,000 miles, organized enough to plan and execute a journey that complicated, proud enough to sit on a station bench refusing help rather than accepting charity she didn't want. The kind of woman who might know how to read ledgers, how to make sense of numbers that looked like gibberish to him, how to tell which debts needed paying first and which creditors would wait. By morning, he'd talked himself out of it 17 times and back into it 16. The bank examiner came Thursday. Today was Tuesday. He had less than 48 hours to make his ranch look like something worth saving, and he didn't have the first damn clue how to do that beyond waving his hands at dying cattle and broken infrastructure. "I'm riding into town," he told Miguel over breakfast that was just coffee, because they'd forgotten to buy bacon. Miguel didn't look up from his cup. "Uh-huh. Need to check on something." "Sure you do." "It's not—" Caleb stopped. What was the point? Miguel knew. Miguel always knew. "Just mind the place while I'm gone." "Always do." The ride to Clearwater took 90 minutes. Caleb spent 89 of them coming up with reasons this was a terrible idea, and the last 60 seconds trying to figure out what the hell he was going to say when he got there. Mrs. Chen's boarding house stood at the end of Main Street, a 2-story structure that had seen better decades but maintained a certain dignity through sheer stubbornness. The kind of place that was clean if not comfortable, respectable if not welcoming. Caleb tied Red to the hitching post and stood there like an idiot trying to think of a single good reason for being here that didn't sound desperate or pathetic or both. The door opened. Eleanor Vance stepped out onto the porch, dressed differently than yesterday. Simpler clothes, more practical. She stopped when she saw him, surprise flickering across her face before settling back into that careful, neutral expression. "Mr. Turner?" "Miss Vance." "It's Mrs., actually, though that's something of a technicality at this point." She descended the stairs slowly, studying him. "Did you need something?" This was the moment. The point where he could invent some excuse about being in town for supplies, about checking on her welfare as a concerned citizen, about anything other than what he'd actually come here to say. Instead, the truth just fell out of his mouth like he'd lost control of it. "I need help with my books, ledgers and accounts, and figuring out which debts to pay before the bank takes everything. And I know that sounds like the worst job offer in Wyoming history, but I also know you're educated and capable and currently stranded in a town that doesn't have much use for educated, capable women. So I'm offering room, board, and whatever wages I can scrape together in exchange for you making sense of numbers that might as well be written in Chinese for all the good they do me." Eleanor stared at him, blinked. "That's your pitch?" "I'm not good at pitches." "Clearly." She descended another step, arms crossed. "Let me see if I understand. You want to hire me, a complete stranger you met yesterday, to manage your finances despite having no knowledge of my qualifications beyond the fact that I can write letters and book train passage?" "You argued with a station master without raising your voice. Takes a particular kind of competence to do that." "That's insane logic." "Probably." Caleb met her eyes. "But I'm 3 days from a bank examiner who's going to take one look at my books and foreclose on a ranch that's been in my family 3 generations. And I'm desperate enough to ask a stranger for help because the alternative is watching everything my grandfather built get auctioned off to men who've been waiting for me to fail. Why me? There must be a bookkeeper in town. There is. He works for the bank. Caleb pulled off his hat, ran a hand through hair that needed cutting. Look, I'm not good at asking for things. Haven't had to do it much. But I'm asking now. Not because I think you need rescuing. You made it pretty clear yesterday you don't. But because maybe we could help each other. You need somewhere to go that isn't back to whatever you left. I need someone who can make sense of ledgers before Thursday. Seems like the kind of problem that might have a practical solution. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, those intelligent eyes cataloging and assessing. Finally, what happened to your wife? The question hit harder than he expected. Fever. Started out like nothing, turned into pneumonia. By the time we got her to a doctor, there wasn't anything to do but watch her die slowly. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Doesn't change anything. No, Eleanor agreed quietly. It doesn't. So, you interested in looking at some terrible ledgers? She smiled, tired but genuine. Mr. Turner, I've traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man I'd never met based on correspondence that turned out to be largely fabricated. My judgment is clearly questionable. But yes, I'll look at your ledgers. On one condition. What's that? You stop looking at me like I'm made of glass that might shatter any moment. I'm 42 years old, I've buried both parents and a brother, and I just survived public humiliation that would have broken someone with less spine. I don't need gentle handling. I need honest work and a reason to stay in Wyoming that doesn't involve crawling back to Boston admitting everyone who said I was foolish was absolutely correct. Caleb found himself smiling again. Twice in 2 days. Probably a record. Deal. When do you need me to start? Bank examiner comes Thursday. Today's Tuesday. I'm aware. Eleanor laughed, sharp and brittle but real. You really are desperate. Fine. Let me get my trunk. I assume you brought something to transport it? Horse. Of course you did. She headed back into the boarding house, returned minutes later with the same trunk from yesterday, heavier than it looked, packed with whatever future she'd imagined that wasn't happening now. They loaded it onto Red's back with some creative rope work that probably wouldn't survive the full journey, but might hold long enough. Eleanor watched without comment, without trying to help or direct, just observing with that same assessing intelligence that suggested she was cataloging exactly how terrible his knot-tying skills were for future reference. This is quite possibly the worst decision either of us has ever made, Eleanor said as they started walking. Red couldn't carry both of them and the trunk, so it was 90 minutes on foot back to the ranch. Probably, Caleb agreed. Your friends are going to have opinions. Don't have friends, just Miguel, and he already suggested this yesterday. The town will talk. Town already talks. Nothing new there. They walked in silence for a while, the sun climbing, heat building, Red plodding steadily between them, carrying a trunk full of a future that wasn't going to happen toward a ranch that might not exist by Friday. Tell me about the ranch, Eleanor said eventually. Not the finances. We'll get to that horror show soon enough. Tell me what it was like before. So Caleb told her. About his grandfather claiming the land when it was still territory, not state. About building the house log by log. About the first winter that nearly killed them all. About his father expanding the herd, modernizing the operation, turning a hard-scrabble homestead into something approaching prosperous. About Sarah managing the practical side while Caleb worked the cattle, the perfect partnership that made everything function smoothly. About how losing her was like removing a load-bearing wall. The whole structure started crumbling, and he couldn't figure out how to stop it. Eleanor listened without interrupting, asking occasional questions that were smart and specific, clearly forming her own assessment of what he was dealing with. So the problem isn't just money, she said finally. It's infrastructure, management, and a complete breakdown of operational systems following the death of the person who actually knew how to run things. When you say it like that, it sounds worse. It probably is worse than you think. Most people in crisis underestimate how bad things really are. She looked at him sideways. But at least you're aware you're in crisis. That's further than a lot of men get before they lose everything. They reached the ranch around 2 p.m, both sweating, both exhausted. Miguel appeared from the barn, took one look at Eleanor, and gave Caleb a nod that clearly meant, "I told you so." "Miguel, this is Mrs. Vance. She's going to help with the books." Ma'am? Miguel tipped his hat. Mr. Just Miguel? Miguel. Eleanor looked around at the ranch, the sagging house, the patched barn, the thin cattle in sparse grass. Her face didn't change, but Caleb could see her cataloging every visible problem, adding them to whatever mental list she was building. I'll show you to a room, Caleb said. It's not much. I wasn't expecting much. Eleanor followed him into the house, up stairs that creaked, down a hallway that needed paint to a small bedroom that had been storage until this morning when he'd hastily cleared it out. She set her trunk down, looked around at the bare space, the single window overlooking failing pastures, the simple bed that was probably older than her. It's honest, she said finally. I appreciate that. The ledgers are downstairs. I can show you. Tomorrow. Eleanor sat on the bed, testing it, wincing slightly. Today I'm going to unpack, settle in, and mentally prepare myself for whatever disaster I'm about to discover in your accounting. You're going to do whatever ranchers do at 2 in the afternoon, and we're going to pretend this arrangement is completely normal and not at all the desperate gamble we both know it is, Caleb almost argued. Then recognized she was right. Pushing forward right now would just be panic masquerading as productivity. There's a well out back. Pump's temperamental, but it works if you're patient with it. Kitchen's downstairs, help yourself to whatever's there, which isn't much, but you're welcome to it. Thank you. He left her there, closing the door on whatever private moment she needed to process the reality of where she'd ended up. Went downstairs to find Miguel waiting with that expression that meant he had opinions. Don't, Caleb said. Wasn't going to say anything. You're thinking it loud enough. Miguel smiled slightly. She seems competent. That's what I'm counting on. Also seems like she's got no patience for nonsense. Also what I'm counting on. Bank examiner still comes Thursday. I know. 2 days to fix 18 months of disaster. I know that too. Caleb grabbed his hat. I'm riding the fence line. If the house catches fire or the cattle stampede, come get me. Otherwise, I'll be back by dark. He escaped before Miguel could point out any other obvious problems. Saddled red again. Poor horse was getting a workout today, and headed out toward the north pasture where wolves kept finding ways in. But he couldn't focus on fencing, couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor Vance upstairs unpacking a trunk full of wedding dreams that would never happen, settling into a room in a failing ranch owned by a man she'd met yesterday, preparing to dig through financial records that would probably confirm just how desperate his situation really was. This was insane. Hiring a complete stranger 3 days before the bank showed up to examine whether he was worth saving. Bringing a woman into his house with no references, no guarantees she knew anything about bookkeeping beyond personal correspondence, no plan beyond maybe she can help. But Sarah had always said sometimes you had to make the desperate play. Sometimes the safe move was just slow death. And you had to risk everything on a chance that probably wouldn't work, but at least offered possibility. The sun was setting by the time he finished riding the fence line, finding and marking 6 more gaps that needed repair he couldn't afford. Red trudged home tired, and Caleb wasn't far behind, body aching, mind exhausted from tallying problems that multiplied faster than solutions. Lights were on in the kitchen when he got back. Unusual. He rarely bothered with lamps, just ate in the dark or didn't eat at all. But tonight, warm light spilled from the windows, and when he stepped inside, he found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by ledgers, papers sorted into piles, a system emerging from chaos. She looked up, face exhausted but focused. Your bookkeeping is criminally bad. I know. I don't think you do. This isn't just disorganized, it's actively misleading. You've been underpaying some creditors and overpaying others, missing opportunities for bulk discounts, and I'm pretty sure you've been accidentally paying property tax twice for the last 3 months. Caleb sat down heavily. Can you fix it? Fix it? No. That would require time travel and a complete do-over of the last 18 months. But I can organize it enough that the bank examiner sees a struggling operation with systemic problems rather than a chaotic disaster with no hope of recovery. Might buy you time. Might not save you, but it'll give you a fighting chance instead of automatic foreclosure. How much time do we have? Well, it's almost 8. Bank examiner comes Thursday morning, so about 36 hours, accounting for sleep we probably won't get. Caleb looked at the piles of paper, the ledgers marked with Sarah's neat handwriting transitioning into his incomprehensible scrawl, The invoices and receipts and statements chronicling 18 months of slow collapse. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Really? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You could have stayed in town, caught the next train east, been back in Boston by next week pretending this whole thing never happened." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, hands resting on Sarah's old ledger. "Because the alternative was admitting defeat. Because I'm tired of being told I'm too old, too educated, too opinionated for whatever role people think I should fill. Because you offered me work instead of charity, partnership instead of rescue. And because I'm curious whether two-people society as written off can actually prove everyone wrong." She looked at him directly. No walls, no performance. Just honesty. "Also because I'm angry, Mr. Turner. Spectacularly, magnificently angry at the man who abandoned me, at the son who looked at me like damaged goods, at every person who ever suggested I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. And I'd much rather channel that anger into saving your ranch than into self-pity or revenge fantasies." Caleb found himself smiling again. Third time in 2 days. Definitely a record. "Fair enough," he said. "Where do you need me to start?" Eleanor pushed a stack of papers toward him. "Tell me about every invoice in that pile. What you bought, when, why. Don't skip anything. Don't try to make it sound better than it was. I need the truth, however ugly." So he told her. About the veterinary bills for cattle that died anyway, the feed purchases that stretched their dwindling credit, the repairs that were temporary patches rather than real fixes. About the decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but in hindsight were just delay tactics, postponing inevitable collapse. Eleanor listened, made notes, asked clarifying questions that were uncomfortable in their precision. By midnight, they'd worked through half the ledgers. By 2 in the morning, she'd reorganized his creditor list into priority tiers. By 4, she'd drafted a preliminary financial statement that at least looked professional, even if the numbers were still terrible. Miguel found them at dawn, still working, slumped at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, coffee cups, and the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting losing battles all night. "You two look like hell," he observed. "Feel like it too," Eleanor agreed without looking up. "But I think we might have something the bank won't immediately laugh at." "Might?" Caleb asked. "Success is relative when you're this far behind." She stretched, vertebrae popping audibly. "We need one more day. One more day to verify these numbers, catch mistakes, make sure nothing catastrophic is hiding in sections I haven't checked yet. Bank comes tomorrow." "I'm aware. Which means we have," she checked the clock, "approximately 20 hours to make 18 months of disaster look like managed decline instead of free fall. Can you do it?" Eleanor looked at him with those sharp, tired eyes. "Mr. Turner, I traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. I survived public abandonment without crying. I spent the night organizing financial chaos that would make a bank auditor weep. At this point, I'm genuinely unsure what I can't do when sufficiently motivated." "Is that a yes?" "That's a we'll find out tomorrow." She stood gathering papers. "I'm going to sleep for 4 hours. Then we're finishing this. And Mr. Turner?" "Yeah. Stop calling me Mrs. Vance. We're past formality at this point. It's Eleanor." "Caleb." She nodded, headed upstairs, footsteps heavy with exhaustion. Miguel watched her go, then looked at Caleb with an expression that was hard to read. "Well?" Caleb asked. "I think you might have found the one person in Wyoming more stubborn than you." "Good. I'm going to need that." Miguel headed out to start the day's work, leaving Caleb alone in the kitchen as sunrise painted the walls gold. Somewhere out there, wolves were probably planning another attack on his cattle. The bank examiner was definitely preparing to deliver bad news. Harrison Kemp was certainly sharpening his pencil, calculating how much he'd bid for this land when it went to auction. But for the first time in 18 months, Caleb felt something other than hopeless resignation. Not confidence, that would be ridiculous, but possibility. The distant, fragile sense that maybe, just maybe, if they worked hard enough and got lucky enough, they might survive this. He picked up Sarah's ledger, ran his fingers over her neat handwriting from better times. "Hope you don't mind I brought someone new," he said to the empty room. "We needed help, and she's good at this, like you were." The house didn't answer. Houses never did. But the morning light was warm, the coffee was strong, and somewhere upstairs a stranger he'd met 2 days ago was sleeping in a spare room, preparing to spend another day fighting to save a ranch she had no stake in except stubborn pride and channeled anger. It wasn't much, but right now it was more than he'd had yesterday. And tomorrow, when the bank examiner came with his clipboard and his calculator and his professional assessment of failure, at least they'd face him together. Two broken people making their desperate stand. It probably wouldn't work, but at least they'd try. The bank examiner arrived at exactly 9 o'clock Thursday morning, driving a polished buggy that looked obscene against the dusty reality of the ranch. His name was Fletcher, middle-aged, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who'd never missed a meal or worried about where the next one was coming from. Caleb watched him descend from the buggy with a leather satchel that probably cost more than 3 months of cattle feed. Eleanor stood beside him on the porch, hands clasped in front of her, wearing a simple gray dress that somehow made her look both respectable and formidable. "Mr. Turner." Fletcher extended his hand. His grip was soft, uncalloused. "Thank you for making time this morning." Like Caleb had a choice. Like this was a social call instead of an execution. "This is Mrs. Vance," Caleb said. "She's been helping organize the accounts." Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly. "I wasn't aware you'd hired professional assistants." "Recent development," Eleanor said smoothly. "I've prepared a comprehensive financial overview for your review, Mr. Fletcher. Shall we discuss it inside, or would you prefer to inspect the property first?" The question was polite, but there was steel underneath it, a subtle assertion of control that shifted the dynamic from interrogation to business meeting. Fletcher blinked, clearly unused to being managed by the people he was examining. "Inside will be fine." They settled at the kitchen table, the same table where Caleb and Eleanor had spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling chaos into something resembling order. Eleanor produced a leather portfolio Caleb hadn't seen before, withdrew documents arranged with tabs and color-coded sections that looked professional in a way his accounting had never approached. Fletcher opened the portfolio, and Caleb watched his expression shift from dismissive to surprised to genuinely focused. He flipped pages slowly, reading detailed breakdowns of creditors, asset valuations, operational costs, and projected income based on current herd size and market conditions. "This is quite thorough," Fletcher said finally. "Thank you." Eleanor's voice remained neutral. "As you can see, the ranch has experienced significant operational challenges following the death of Mr. Turner's wife 18 months ago. Mrs. Turner managed the financial operations, and her absence created systemic problems that compounded over time." She was framing it, not making excuses, but providing context that transformed his failures from incompetence into understandable crisis. Caleb felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Fletcher continued reading, occasionally making notes in a small ledger he'd brought. The silence stretched, broken only by the scratch of his pen and the ticking of Sarah's grandmother's clock on the mantel. "Your debt-to-asset ratio is concerning," Fletcher said. "It is," Eleanor agreed. "However, the assets themselves remain sound. The land holds value independent of current operational challenges. The herd, while reduced, consists of quality breeding stock. With proper management and a restructured payment schedule, the operation can return to profitability within 18 to 24 months. That's optimistic. That's accurate, provided the bank is willing to work with us rather than foreclose prematurely." Fletcher looked up sharply at the word, us. His gaze moved between Eleanor and Caleb, clearly trying to parse the relationship. "Hired bookkeeper? Something else?" "Mrs. Vance, forgive my confusion, but what exactly is your role here?" "I manage the financial operations," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Mr. Turner handles the ranch work, livestock management, and infrastructure. It's a division of labor that allows each of us to focus on our respective competencies." It wasn't a lie, exactly. Just a very generous interpretation of a partnership that was barely 3 days old. Fletcher returned to the documents, flipping to a section detailing proposed payment schedules. "You're asking for a 6-month deferment on principal payments. We're requesting realistic terms that acknowledge current market conditions and operational capacity," Eleanor corrected. "Forcing immediate full payment simply guarantees default and foreclosure, which benefits no one. The bank loses a reliable long-term customer, and Mr. Turner loses generational land. A temporary adjustment allows both parties to achieve their actual objectives. The bank's objective is repayment. Then the bank should support restructuring that makes repayment possible rather than demanding terms that guarantee failure. Caleb had never heard anyone talk to a bank examiner like that. Calm, logical, but absolutely refusing to accept the premise that the bank's timeline was inevitable or reasonable. Fletcher looked like he wasn't sure whether to be offended or impressed. "I'll need to inspect the property," Fletcher said, closing the portfolio. "See the actual assets we're discussing." "Of course." Caleb stood. "I'll show you around." They spent the next 2 hours walking fence lines, examining cattle, inspecting buildings. Fletcher made notes constantly, asking questions about maintenance schedules, breeding programs, water rights, and a dozen other details Caleb answered as honestly as he could. The ranch looked rough. There was no hiding that. Fences needed repair, buildings needed paint, the herd was thin. But it was still functional, still viable if you looked past immediate problems to underlying potential. Eleanor didn't accompany them on the tour. Her role was financial, and she played it perfectly, staying back at the house, organizing additional documents in case Fletcher requested them. But Caleb could feel her presence anyway, like she'd somehow shifted the gravity of the entire situation just by refusing to accept defeat as inevitable. They returned to the house around noon. Miguel had prepared coffee. Terrible coffee, but hot and strong, and Eleanor had laid out additional financial projections on the table. "Your assessment, Mr. Fletcher?" Eleanor asked. Fletcher sat, accepted coffee he didn't drink, and spent a long moment reviewing his notes. Finally, "The operation is struggling, but not beyond recovery. The financial records, while showing significant debt, also demonstrate systematic organization and realistic planning. That's not what I expected to find." "What did you expect?" Caleb asked. "Honestly, chaos. Most operations at this stage are completely disorganized, run by people who've given up pretending they can fix things. You haven't given up. That matters." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Does it matter enough for restructuring? I can recommend a modified payment schedule to the board. 6 months deferred principal, interest-only payments during that period, with full resumption of standard terms afterward. I can't guarantee approval, but I can advocate for it." It wasn't salvation, but it was possibility. Actual tangible possibility. "Thank you," Caleb said. Fletcher gathered his papers, preparing to leave. At the door, he paused, looking at Eleanor with open curiosity. "Mrs. Vance, I don't mean to pry, but you're quite skilled at financial management. Have you worked in banking?" "No, I managed household accounts and estate planning for my family in Boston. Nothing professional, but apparently transferable skills." "Apparently," Fletcher tipped his hat. "Mr. Turner, you're fortunate to have found such competent assistants." After he left, Caleb and Eleanor stood on the porch watching dust settle behind his departing buggy. The tension that had been holding them rigid for 2 days suddenly released, and Caleb felt exhaustion crash over him like a physical weight. "We did it," he said. "We survived it," Eleanor corrected. "Whether we actually accomplished anything won't be clear until the bank board meets next week. But he's recommending restructuring. Recommending isn't approving. Don't celebrate yet." Caleb looked at her. This woman who'd appeared 3 days ago with nothing but a trunk and wounded pride, who'd spent 2 sleepless nights organizing his disaster into something presentable, who'd faced down a bank examiner with more competence than he'd managed in 18 months. "Why are you really here?" he asked. "And don't give me the answer about channeling anger. There's something else." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring out at land she had no claim to, no history with, no reason to care about. "Because I'm tired of being invisible," she said finally. "In Boston, I was the unmarried sister who managed the household after our parents died. When my brother married, I became the maiden aunt who was tolerated but not essential. Every year older meant becoming more irrelevant, more easily dismissed. The mail order arrangement seemed like a chance to be necessary again, to be valued for what I could contribute rather than pitied for what I lacked." She turned to look at him. "You didn't offer me pity, Caleb. You offered me work, a role, something that mattered. That's rarer than you might think." Before Caleb could respond, Miguel appeared from the barn, moving quickly enough to signal trouble. "Boss, we got a problem. Found 2 more calves dead near Willow Creek. Wolves got them overnight." The brief moment of relief evaporated. Of course, because nothing could ever just be solved without 3 new problems appearing. "Show me," Caleb said. The scene at Willow Creek was brutal. 2 calves, maybe 3 months old, torn apart and partially eaten. The wolves had been efficient, taking what they wanted and leaving the rest for scavengers. "That's 7 this month," Miguel said. "At this rate, we'll lose the whole spring crop before summer." Caleb crouched by the nearest carcass, studying tracks in the soft earth near the creek. Large paws, multiple animals, a pack, not a lone hunter. "How many you think?" 4, maybe 5. They're smart too, hitting different sections, testing fences, finding weak spots. "We can't afford to lose more cattle. Can't afford the ammunition to hunt them properly either." It was true. Every bullet cost money they didn't have, but doing nothing meant watching their herd get picked apart, and they couldn't afford that either. Classic impossible choice. Eleanor had followed them out, picking her way carefully through rough terrain in city boots that weren't made for this kind of walking. She studied the kill site without flinching, cataloging details with that same analytical focus she'd applied to ledgers. "How much would proper fencing cost?" she asked. "Strong enough to actually keep them out?" "More than we have," Caleb said. "Give me a number." "Maybe $200 for materials, plus labor to install it properly." Eleanor was quiet, thinking. "And if we don't fix this? We lose another 10, 15 calves before fall. At current market rates, that's about $400 in lost value. So spending $200 now saves $400 later. Except we don't have $200 now. But the bank might approve restructuring next week, which means we could potentially access emergency operational credit." She looked at Miguel. "How quickly could you install proper fencing if we had materials? Me and Caleb working together? Maybe a week for the most vulnerable sections." "Then that's what we do. We wait for bank approval, request emergency credit specifically for predator mitigation, and fix the fence properly instead of patching it indefinitely." Caleb wanted to argue that it was too risky, that counting on bank approval was foolish, that they should conserve what little they had rather than gambling on credit that might not materialize. But the logic was sound: spending money to save money, investment instead of triage. "All right," he said, "we wait for the bank, but if they approve, we move fast." They rode back to the ranch in silence, each processing their own version of the day's events. The bank examiner had gone better than expected. The wolf problem was worse than feared. Everything balanced on a knife edge between recovery and collapse. That night, Eleanor cooked dinner. Actual dinner, not just coffee and whatever didn't require preparation. She'd apparently been to Morrison's store in town, used her own money to buy supplies they desperately needed. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said. "I'm eating here, aren't I? Seems fair to contribute." She set plates on the table. Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread and salt pork, but it felt like abundance after weeks of barely eating. They ate in companionable silence until Miguel, who joined them at Eleanor's insistence, finally asked the question that had been hanging unspoken all day. "What happens if the bank says no?" Eleanor and Caleb exchanged glances. Neither wanted to voice it, but the answer sat heavy between them. "Then we figure out Plan B," Eleanor said. "What's Plan B?" "I don't know yet. That's why it's not Plan A." Miguel smiled at that, some of the tension breaking. "You're all right, Mrs. Vance." "Eleanor, and you're not so terrible yourself." After Miguel left for his small cabin near the barn, Caleb and Eleanor cleaned dishes in silence. The clock ticked toward evening, shadows lengthening across the kitchen floor. "I should tell you something," Caleb said, drying the last plate. "People are going to talk. Already are, probably. About you being here. Let them talk. It might get uncomfortable. I survived being publicly abandoned at a train station, Caleb. I think I can handle some gossip." She hung the dish towel neatly, turned to face him. "Unless you're worried about your reputation." "My reputation's already shot. Failed rancher, can't manage his own accounts, needs a woman to save him from the bank." "Is that what bothers you? That I'm a woman?" "No. What bothers me is that it's true. I did need saving. Still do, probably." Eleanor studied him with those sharp eyes. "You know what I've learned? Needing help isn't weakness. Refusing it is. You could have let pride destroy you. Instead, you asked a stranger for assistance. That took more courage than pretending you could fix everything alone. Doesn't feel courageous. Feels desperate. Sometimes they're the same thing." She was right, of course. But admitting it felt like acknowledging defeat in some fundamental way he wasn't ready to accept. "Get some sleep," Eleanor said. Tomorrow, we start planning what happens after the bank decision, whichever way it goes. But sleep didn't come easy. Caleb lay awake listening to the house settle, thinking about wolves and banks, and the strange woman sleeping down the hall who'd somehow become essential to his survival in less than a week. The next morning brought visitors. Caleb was repairing a fence post when he saw the buggy approaching, expensive, well-maintained, pulled by horses that had never missed a meal. Harrison Kemp's buggy. Kemp descended like a man visiting property he already owned, surveying the ranch with poorly concealed satisfaction. He was mid-50s, prosperous gut, eyes that calculated value and found most things lacking. Turner. No mister, no courtesy. Just surname and assumption of superiority. Kemp. Heard you had a bank examiner out yesterday. Must have been quite a conversation. News traveled fast in small towns. Probably had every detail by noon. Went fine. Did it? Kemp smiled without warmth. That's not what I heard. Heard you're drowning in debt, cattle dying, operation falling apart. Heard the bank's about ready to call the whole note. You heard wrong. We'll see. Kemp turned his attention to the house, where Eleanor had appeared on the porch. Also heard you've taken in a woman, the one who got abandoned at the station. That true? Mrs. Vance is helping with the accounts. Mrs. Vance. Kemp's smile widened. Is that what we're calling it? Helping with accounts? Caleb felt anger flare hot and immediate. Careful. I'm just saying, people talk. Woman shows up out of nowhere, moves into a widower's house 3 days later. Suddenly she's helping with accounts. Looks questionable, Turner. The only thing questionable here is you showing up uninvited to spread gossip. Eleanor had descended from the porch, moving toward them with deliberate calm. Mr. Kemp, I presume. I've heard about you from the merchants in town. Nothing good, I hope. Kemp tried charm, but it sat wrong on him like an ill-fitting coat. Quite informative, actually. Apparently you've been hoping to acquire this property for some time. Made several offers over the years, all declined. Must be frustrating, watching Mr. Turner continue to refuse your generosity. The charm evaporated. This ranch is failing. Everyone knows it. Better to sell now while there's still value than watch the bank take it for nothing. Better for whom? Eleanor asked. Certainly not for Mr. Turner, who'd lose generational land for a fraction of its worth. And frankly, I question whether it's actually failing or whether interested parties have simply been spreading that narrative hoping to manufacture a crisis. Kemp's face darkened. Lady, I don't know who you think you are. I know exactly who I am. The question is whether you know who you are, Mr. Kemp. A vulture circling wounded prey, hoping exhaustion does your work for you. It's not complicated. It's just sad. For a moment, Caleb thought Kemp might actually lose his temper completely. His face reddened, jaw clenched, hands balling into fists. But he caught himself, forced a smile that looked painful. This ranch will be on the auction block by fall, Kemp said. And when it is, I'll buy it for whatever pittance the bank's willing to accept. You can play house with your bookkeeper until then, Turner. Won't change the ending. He climbed back into his buggy and drove off, leaving dust and threat hanging in the air. Pleasant man, Eleanor observed. He's been trying to buy this land for 15 years. Pa refused him. I've refused him. Drives him crazy that we won't just sell and let him expand his empire. He seemed very confident the bank would foreclose. He's probably got someone inside feeding him information. That's how he works. Finds leverage, applies pressure, waits for people to break. Eleanor watched the buggy disappear toward town. Then we need to make sure we don't break. The bank's decision came Tuesday afternoon, delivered by courier rather than Fletcher personally. Caleb signed for the envelope with hands that wanted to shake, carried it inside where Eleanor waited at the kitchen table. Open it, she said. He did, unfolding official letterhead, reading words that blurred together until he forced himself to focus. They approved restructuring, he said, not quite believing it. 6 months deferred principal, interest-only payments, emergency operational credit up to $500 for approved expenses. Eleanor released a breath she'd been holding. $500 is enough for fencing and some infrastructure repair. It's enough to survive. It's enough to start fighting back. They sat in silence, letting the reality settle. Not victory. They were still drowning in debt, still struggling with wolves and drought and a dozen other problems. But they had breathing room, time, possibility. We should celebrate, Caleb said. How? Good question. He couldn't remember the last time he'd celebrated anything. I have no idea. Eleanor smiled, genuine, tired, but real. Then we'll figure that out too. Same way we figure out everything else, by making it up as we go and hoping it works. That evening, Miguel returned from town with news that wiped away any lingering celebration. Bank approved your restructuring, he said. Everyone's talking about it. Also talking about Eleanor. Let them talk, Eleanor said. It's not just talk. Mrs. Chen at the boarding house heard from Morrison, who heard from someone at the saloon that Kemp's spreading stories, saying you're not really helping with books, saying the arrangement's improper, getting people riled up about morality and proper behavior. Caleb felt cold settle into his gut. He's trying to force her out. Or force you into doing something about it, Miguel said. Making the situation public enough that you have to respond or look like you're confirming what he's implying. Eleanor's face had gone carefully neutral. What exactly is he implying? That you're living here inappropriately, that the whole bookkeeper story is a cover for something else. Something else, Eleanor repeated flatly. He means he's calling me a mistress, calling this arrangement immoral. Miguel nodded, uncomfortable but honest. The silence stretched, broken only by the clock's ticking. Caleb's mind raced through options, all of them bad. He could confront Kemp directly, but that would just create more scandal. He could ignore it, but the damage to Eleanor's already fragile reputation would be permanent. He could ask her to leave, but that felt like capitulation to exactly the kind of judgment she'd come here to escape. There is one solution, Eleanor said quietly. What? We make it legitimate. Legally, publicly legitimate. Caleb stared at her. You're not suggesting marriage. She said it calmly, like proposing a business merger rather than a life-changing commitment. Not for romance, not even for companionship necessarily, but for practicality. It stops the gossip, legitimizes my presence here, and honestly, it might help with the bank. Married couple running a ranch together looks more stable than bachelor rancher and hired bookkeeper. That's insane. Is it? More insane than me moving here in the first place? More insane than us managing to convince a bank examiner we're worth saving? We're already living the scandal, Caleb. We might as well make it legal and remove the ammunition. Miguel stood quietly by the door, clearly trying to determine if he should leave or stay. Caleb waved him out, and he fled gratefully, leaving them alone with the preposterous suggestion hanging between them. You can't be serious, Caleb said. I'm completely serious. Think about it logically. We're already partners in the ranch operation. We already live under the same roof. Marriage would simply formalize an existing arrangement and stop people like Kemp from using propriety as a weapon. Marriage is more than paperwork. Not if we decide it isn't. Not if we go into it with clear understanding that it's a practical partnership rather than a romantic one. Eleanor leaned forward. I'm 42 years old. I've already been rejected once for being too old for marriage. I'm not harboring illusions about romance or fairy tale endings, but I am interested in building something functional and stable. If that happens to come with legal protection and social legitimacy, so much the better. And when you meet someone you actually want to marry, then we'll deal with it. But right now I'm more interested in surviving the next 6 months than planning for hypothetical futures. She met his eyes. Are you? Caleb thought about Sarah, about vows they'd made that meant everything, about love that had been real and deep and completely different from what Eleanor was proposing. This wouldn't be that, could never be that. But maybe it could be something else. Something built on mutual necessity and respect instead of passion. Something honest about what it was instead of pretending to be what it wasn't. People would still talk, he said. People are already talking. At least this way they'd be wrong about the details. The bank might see through it. The bank approved restructuring for a struggling rancher with a bookkeeper. A married couple running the operation together is an improvement on paper, whatever the private reality. She was right, logically, practically right, and yet everything in him recoiled from the idea of marriage as transaction, partnership as contract, vows as strategy. I need to think about it, he said. Of course. But Caleb, don't take too long. Kemp's not going to wait for us to feel comfortable before he escalates. That night, Caleb rode out to the East Ridge where Sarah was buried. He hadn't visited since the funeral, couldn't bear to, but tonight he needed to talk to her even if she couldn't answer. The grave sat under the cottonwood tree she'd loved, marked by a simple stone Miguel had helped him place. Caleb sat beside it, back against the tree, watching stars emerge in a sky so vast it made everything feel small and temporary. "I don't know what to do," he said to the darkness, to Sarah, to himself. Eleanor's practical and smart and probably right that marriage makes sense. But it feels like betraying what we had, turning something sacred into something tactical. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, creating sounds that weren't words but felt like listening anyway. "She's not you, could never be you. But maybe that's the point. Maybe this isn't about replacing what we had, but about building something different. Something that serves a purpose, even if it isn't love." He sat there for a long time, until cold drove him back to the ranch, back to a house where Eleanor sat at the kitchen table working on plans for fence repair, practical and focused, and completely unbothered by the fact that she'd just proposed marriage to a man she barely knew. "I'll do it," Caleb said from the doorway. Eleanor looked up, unsurprised. "You're sure?" "No, but you're right that it solves more problems than it creates. And if we're going to do this, we should do it quickly, before either of us thinks about it too hard and talks ourselves out of it. Tomorrow? Why wait?" Eleanor smiled, tired but genuine. Why wait indeed? They rode into Clearwater Station the next morning under a sky-threatening rain, neither speaking much, both caught in their own thoughts about what they were about to do. Eleanor sat beside Caleb on the wagon bench wearing the same gray dress she'd worn for the bank examiner, practical and respectable. No wedding dress, no flowers, no pretense that this was anything other than what it was. A transaction, a solution, a partnership formalized in ink and witness signatures. The courthouse sat at the end of Main Street, a two-story brick building that served as administrative center for a county too small to need much administration. Judge Warren handled everything from property disputes to marriage licenses to the occasional criminal proceeding, usually in that order of frequency. Caleb tied the horses and stood there, hand on the hitching post, trying to make his feet move toward the courthouse steps. "Second thoughts?" Eleanor asked. "About 100 of them. Want to leave?" He looked at her. She wasn't nervous, or if she was, she hid it perfectly. Just calm, practical Eleanor, solving problems the only way she knew how, with logic and determination and refusal to let emotion complicate necessity. "No," he said. "You?" "I stopped believing in fairy tales around the time I turned 30. This is honest, at least. That's more than most marriages can claim." They climbed the steps together, pushed through heavy doors into a lobby that smelled like old wood and older paper. A clerk sat behind a desk, young man with ink-stained fingers who looked up with the bored expression of someone whose job rarely involved anything interesting. "Help you?" "We need to see Judge Warren," Caleb said, "about a marriage license." The clerk's expression shifted from bored to curious. Small towns being what they were, he probably already knew who they were, probably had heard the gossip, probably couldn't wait to spread this new development. "Judge is in his chambers. I'll let him know you're here." The clerk disappeared through a side door, and they could hear muffled conversation, then footsteps approaching. Judge Warren appeared, 60s, white beard, eyes that had seen enough human foolishness to be surprised by very little. He took one look at Caleb and Eleanor, and his eyebrows rose slightly. "Turner, Mrs. Vance." He said her name without judgment, which was more than most people had managed. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Eleanor asked. "Seems fairly straightforward to me. We'd like to apply for a marriage license. Today? Is there a waiting period?" "Technically, no, but most people take time to—" "We've taken sufficient time," Eleanor interrupted. "We're both adults, both capable of making informed decisions, and both aware of exactly what we're doing. If there's no legal barrier, I see no reason to delay." Warren looked at Caleb. "This is what you want?" "It is." "You've known each other, what, a week?" 8 days, Eleanor said. "But I fail to see how duration of acquaintance is legally relevant to marriage eligibility. Unless Wyoming has statutes I'm unaware of?" Warren almost smiled at that. "No, ma'am. No statutes about courtship duration." He gestured toward his chambers. "Come on back. We'll get the paperwork sorted." The office was cluttered with legal volumes and case files, a desk buried under pending matters, windows that needed cleaning overlooking the street below. Warren settled behind his desk, pulled out forms, and began the administrative process of converting two separate lives into one legal entity. Full names? Caleb James Turner. Eleanor Margaret Vance. Previous marriages? Widower, Caleb said. Widow. Eleanor lied smoothly, because admitting she'd never been married, despite the Mrs. Honorific, would open questions neither of them wanted to answer. Warren didn't challenge it, just wrote it down. Any legal impediments to marriage? Existing contracts, debts that would transfer, custody arrangements? They both said no, and Warren continued through the bureaucratic checklist, asking questions that felt simultaneously invasive and completely irrelevant. Did it matter where Eleanor was born? Did anyone care that Caleb's father's middle name was Andrew? The machinery of official recognition ground forward regardless. I need 2 witnesses, Warren said, looking up. You bring anyone? They hadn't. Hadn't thought that far ahead, honestly. Caleb looked at Eleanor, who shrugged slightly. I can grab someone from the street, Warren offered. Usually find a couple folks willing to sign for $1. So that's what they did. Warren sent his clerk out, who returned minutes later with 2 men who looked like they'd been drinking since breakfast but were functional enough to sign their names. One was a drifter passing through town, the other a ranch hand from one of the neighboring properties. Neither asked questions, just witnessed signatures and pocketed their dollars. Warren produced the marriage license, filled in with their information, blank spaces waiting for signatures that would make it official. He pushed it across the desk along with a pen. Once you sign this and I perform the ceremony, you're legally married in the eyes of Wyoming Territory and the United States government. That clear? Perfectly, Eleanor said, picking up the pen. Her hand was steady as she signed her name in neat, precise script. She passed the pen to Caleb. His hand wasn't as steady. He stared at the line waiting for his signature, thinking about Sarah, about vows made with love and intention, about how wrong this felt, even though it was right for all the practical reasons. Caleb? Eleanor's voice was quiet. We don't have to do this. Yes, we do. No. We have options. We could ignore the gossip, weather the scandal, tell Kemp to go to hell. Marriage isn't the only solution. It's the best one. Best and right aren't always the same thing. He looked at her, this woman who'd appeared in his life like a storm, unexpected, disruptive, and somehow exactly what was needed, even if he hadn't known it. She was giving him an exit, permission to back out, space to choose differently. But she was also right that this solved problems, made things simpler in ways that mattered. And maybe, in some strange way he didn't fully understand yet, it was also what he needed. Not romance, not replacement for Sarah, but partnership with someone who saw him clearly and chose to stay anyway. He signed his name. Warren stood, produced a small book, looked like a Bible, but Caleb suspected it was just a convenient prop the judge kept for these occasions. All right then, let's make this official. Join hands. They did, awkwardly, Eleanor's hand cool and dry in his. The 2 witnesses slouched against the wall, bored now that they'd been paid. Warren opened his book and began reading words that were probably standard but barely registered through the unreality of the moment. Do you, Caleb James Turner, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death do you part? I do. Do you, Eleanor Margaret Vance, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death do you part? I do. By the power vested in me by Wyoming Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss if you're so inclined, though I won't insist on it. They didn't kiss, just stood there holding hands in a judge's cluttered office while 2 drunk witnesses shifted uncomfortably and rain started pattering against the windows. That's it? Eleanor asked. That's it. You're married. Congratulations. Warren handed Caleb the signed license. File this with the county clerk when you get a chance. Copy costs 50 cents if you need one for your records. They walked out of the courthouse into light rain, legally joined, fundamentally unchanged. The horses waited patiently at the hitching post. Main Street looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. Nothing felt different except everything was. Well, Eleanor said, that was dramatically underwhelming. Caleb almost laughed. Would have, if the whole situation wasn't so strange. What were you expecting? I don't know. Something more than a drunk drifter watching me pledge my life to a man I met 8 days ago in a room that smelled like mildew. We could do it again somewhere nicer. No, this feels appropriately honest. No pretense, no performance, just two people making a practical decision and following through. She climbed onto the wagon. Should we tell people? News will spread fast enough without us helping. True. Small towns being what they are, everyone will know by sunset. Eleanor settled on the bench, arranging her skirt. We should probably discuss expectations. For what? For the marriage, division of responsibilities, living arrangements, boundaries, all the things normal couples discuss before getting married that we're addressing afterward. Caleb climbed up beside her, took the reins. Seems backwards. Everything about this is backwards. Might as well embrace it. She waited until they were clear of town before continuing. I'll keep managing the books and household. You handle the ranch operations and livestock. We continue as we have been, just with legal recognition. That's it? What else is there? We're not pretending this is a love match. We're not sharing... She hesitated, choosing words carefully. We're not sharing everything that married couples typically share. This is a business partnership with legal benefits. Let's not complicate it by pretending otherwise. It made sense. Perfect, logical sense. And yet something about the clinical efficiency of it felt wrong in ways Caleb couldn't articulate. They rode in silence for a while, rain increasing from sprinkle to steady downpour, both getting soaked because neither had thought to bring rain gear. The horses plodded forward, unbothered, while Caleb and Eleanor sat side by side, married, separate, together, alone. My room stays my room, Eleanor said finally, and yours stays yours. Agreed? Agreed. And if either of us becomes uncomfortable with the arrangement, we discuss it honestly rather than letting resentment build. Fine. I'm serious, Caleb. This only works if we're honest with each other, about everything. He looked at her, water dripping from her hair, dress soaked, sitting ramrod straight despite discomfort. You always this practical about everything? I found that emotions rarely solve problems. They just make the solutions harder to see. Sarah used to say something similar, that I felt too much and thought too little. Was she right? Probably. Caleb guided the horses around a muddy patch in the road. You really think this is going to work? The marriage, I mean? I think it has as much chance as any marriage. Better than some, considering we have no illusions about what it is. By the time they reached the ranch, they were thoroughly drenched, and the rain had turned the yard into a mud pit. Miguel emerged from the barn, took one look at them, and his face went carefully neutral. You did it, he said. Statement, not question. We did, Eleanor confirmed, climbing down from the wagon. Any objections? Not my place to have objections. That's not what I asked. Miguel considered, then shrugged. You're both adults. You made a choice. Either it'll work or it won't, but at least you tried something instead of just letting Kemp win by default. Practical assessment, Eleanor said. I appreciate that. Inside, she disappeared upstairs to change into dry clothes, while Caleb stood in the kitchen dripping onto floorboards that didn't need more water damage. When she returned, she'd changed into work clothes. Simple dress, apron, hair tied back, and immediately began organizing supplies for dinner like nothing unusual had happened. Shouldn't we, acknowledge this somehow? Caleb asked. Acknowledge what? We got married. Now we need to eat. One doesn't preclude the other. Most people celebrate. Most people marry for love. We married for survival. Different context, different response. She pulled out flour, started measuring. If you want to mark the occasion, you could fix that leak in the parlor ceiling. I put a bucket under it this morning, but it's nearly full. So that's what he did. Fixed a leak while his new wife made dinner, Miguel tended horses, and rain drummed steady on the roof. The most anticlimactic wedding day in Wyoming history, probably. That evening, they ate together at the kitchen table. Caleb, Eleanor, and Miguel, who seemed determined to pretend everything was completely normal. They discussed fence repairs, supply orders, and whether the rain would help or hurt the grazing situation. Not one word about the marriage. It wasn't until Miguel left and they were cleaning dishes that Eleanor finally addressed it. People are going to expect things to change. What things? How we act together. Public displays of something. Affection. probably, or at least partnership. We should probably establish some baseline of normal couple behavior or risk looking suspicious. Caleb dried a plate, thinking, what does normal couple behavior look like? I have no idea. I've never been part of a normal couple. She handed him another plate. But I imagine it involves some level of comfort with each other. Not performing for others, just ease. Right now, we're very careful around each other. That'll look odd to people who think we married for conventional reasons. So we should be less careful? We should be more natural, whatever that means for us. It was strange advice from a woman who approached everything with calculated precision. But she wasn't wrong. They did move around each other like strangers, being excessively polite, maintaining distance that would look odd in a married couple. I'll try, Caleb said. So will I. That night, lying in bed in his room, still his room, as agreed, Caleb stared at the ceiling thinking about the woman sleeping down the hall. His wife. Legal, official, completely unromantic wife who'd married him for practicality and scandal prevention. Sarah would have hated this, or maybe she would have understood. Hard to say. She'd been practical about some things, sentimental about others. Would she have wanted him to stay alone forever, drowning in grief and debt? Or would she have approved of him finding partnership even if it wasn't love? Questions with no answers. Just rain on the roof and an empty room and a marriage that felt less like beginning and more like temporary ceasefire in a war he didn't know how to win. Morning brought Morrison from the general store, riding out specifically to congratulate them. Word had spread overnight, exactly as Eleanor predicted. Heard you two got married, Morrison said, accepting coffee Eleanor offered. Quick courtship. Sometimes you know what you want, Eleanor said smoothly. No point delaying once the decision's made. Practical approach. Morrison looked between them, clearly trying to assess whether this was real marriage or arrangement. Town's buzzing about it. Kemp's particularly interested. I'm sure he is, Caleb said. He's telling people it's suspicious, that the timing's convenient, happening right after the bank approved your restructuring. Says it looks like you're gaming the system somehow. Eleanor laughed, sharp and bitter. Gaming the system? That's rich coming from a man who spent 15 years trying to manipulate people into selling him land they don't want to part with. Not defending him, just passing along what's being said. Morrison finished his coffee. But I'll tell you what I told the folks at the store. It's nobody's business but yours. You want to get married after a week? That's your choice. Anyone who has a problem with it can mind their own affairs. After Morrison left, Eleanor stood at the window watching him ride away. It's starting. What is? The scrutiny. Everyone watching to see if we're legitimate, looking for cracks in the story, waiting for us to slip up and prove Kemp right. So we don't slip up. Easier said than done. We're not actors, Caleb. We're two people pretending a marriage of convenience is a love match. That's hard to maintain under constant observation. She was right, but admitting it felt like accepting defeat before they'd even started. We'll figure it out. Will we? Eleanor turned from the window. Because I'm starting to wonder if we've made things worse instead of better. At least before, people just thought I was your bookkeeper. Now they think we're liars or frauds or both. Let them think whatever they want. That attitude works fine until it affects the bank's perception, or until Kemp uses it as ammunition to challenge the restructuring. She sat down heavily. I'm sorry. I suggested this. I convinced you it was the right solution, and now I'm worried I've dragged us both into something that's going to explode spectacularly. It was the first time he'd seen her doubt herself. Not just question tactics, but genuinely worry she'd miscalculated. It made her seem more human, less like the competent force of nature who'd blown into his life solving problems. We made this choice together, Caleb said. If it explodes, we'll deal with it together. That's what partners do. Is that what we are? Partners? What else would you call it? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I don't know. I just know this feels more complicated than I expected. The complications multiplied over the following days. Neighbors stopped by with wedding gifts they couldn't afford to refuse, preserves, fabric, a set of dishes that had probably been gathering dust in someone's attic. Each gift came with questions dressed as pleasantries, curiosity masked as courtesy. How did you meet? How did you know? What are your plans? Eleanor handled it beautifully, weaving truth and omission into responses that satisfied without revealing anything substantive. Yes, they'd met at the train station. Yes, it was quick. No, they weren't planning a big celebration. Yes, they were very happy. The lies got easier each time, which worried Caleb more than the lying itself. A week after the wedding, they took the emergency credit from the bank and ordered fencing materials. Miguel and Caleb spent long days installing it properly, reinforcing weak sections, creating barriers the wolves would actually struggle with instead of casual obstacles they could bypass. Eleanor managed the money, negotiated with suppliers, kept them under budget while still getting quality materials. She was good at it, better than good. Had a knack for finding value, negotiating terms, making limited resources stretch further than they had any right to. You should have been running a business, Caleb told her one evening after she'd managed to save $15 on a lumber order through aggressive negotiation. Women don't run businesses in Boston. We manage households and smile prettily at our husbands' associates and pretend we don't have thoughts about anything more complex than flower arrangements. That sounds terrible. It was, which is why I'm here instead. She made a note in the ledger, precise and careful. Although I'm starting to wonder if I traded one set of constraints for another. What do you mean? At least in Boston, nobody expected me to pretend I was in love. Here, I have to maintain a performance every time we're in public. Smile at you appropriately, stand close enough to seem married, but not so close it's obviously staged. Remember to call you husband instead of Caleb when others are listening. It's exhausting. He hadn't thought about it from her perspective, too busy managing his own discomfort with the deception to consider hers. We could tell people the truth. What truth? That we married for convenience and scandal prevention? That'll go over well. Really strengthen our position with the bank and the community. So we just keep lying? We keep protecting our interests. That's different from lying. But her voice lacked conviction, and Caleb suspected she was trying to convince herself as much as him. The fence installation took 10 days of hard labor. By the end, they'd reinforced every vulnerable section, created real barriers instead of suggestions, given themselves actual defense against the wolves. 3 days after completion, they found tracks where the pack had tested the new fence, found it solid, and moved on to easier prey. It worked, Miguel said, examining the tracks. They're looking elsewhere. For now, Caleb said. They'll be back when they get desperate enough. Maybe, but at least now we're prepared. Miguel headed back toward the barn, then paused. You and Eleanor doing all right? Why do you ask? You both look tired. Not work tired, something else. Caleb didn't know how to explain the exhaustion that came from maintaining constant vigilance, never quite relaxing, always aware they were one slip away from exposure. We're fine. If you say so. Miguel didn't push, just headed off to whatever task needed handling next. That night, Eleanor made a mistake. Small thing, barely noticeable, but it cracked the careful facade they'd been maintaining. They'd gone to Morrison's store for supplies, standing together at the counter while Morrison tallied their order. Another customer, Mrs. Patterson, notorious gossip, engaged them in conversation about married life, asking intrusive questions with false sweetness. And where did you honeymoon? She asked, like it was reasonable inquiry instead of fishing for scandal. We didn't, Eleanor said. The ranch doesn't allow for extended absence. Oh, but surely a few days. No, Eleanor said firmly. We had work to do, still do. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to get these supplies home before dark. It was fine, perfectly reasonable, until Mrs. Patterson pressed further. Well, you at least had a proper wedding night celebration? Eleanor's face went completely blank for a moment, not neutral, not careful, but genuinely thrown by the audacity of the question. In that moment of shock, she looked at Caleb with an expression that was pure confusion about how to respond, and Mrs. Patterson saw it. Saw the hesitation, the uncertainty, the complete lack of intimate familiarity between them. Interesting, Mrs. Patterson said slowly, smile sharpening. Very interesting indeed. They left quickly after that, loading supplies in tense silence. Not until they were well out of town did Eleanor speak. I made a mistake. You got asked an inappropriate question. And instead of deflecting smoothly, I froze like a child caught lying. She saw it, Caleb. Saw exactly what we are. Two people playing at marriage without the first idea how married people actually behave with each other. So she gossips. She was going to anyway. This is different. This is evidence instead of speculation. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. I've made everything worse. Again. Stop. We knew this would be hard. We're learning as we go. At what point do we admit we're not learning fast enough? Caleb didn't have an answer to that. The gossip reached them 3 days later through Miguel, who'd heard it in town. Mrs. Patterson was telling anyone who'd listen that the Turner marriage was obviously a sham, that they didn't act like newlyweds, that the whole thing was probably about the bank restructuring and nothing else. She wasn't wrong, which made it harder to refute. Kemp's using it, Miguel reported, saying it proves you're trying to defraud the bank, that Eleanor's presence is suspicious from the start, that the whole operation should be investigated more thoroughly. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. Can he actually challenge the restructuring? Don't know, but he's friendly with people on the bank board. If he pushes hard enough, makes enough noise about impropriety, they might reconsider. That night, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with financial records spread around her, but she wasn't working, just staring at numbers that didn't matter if the bank pulled its support. I'm going to leave, she said quietly. What? I'm going to leave. Go back east, remove myself from the situation. It's the only way to stop Kemp from using me as ammunition against you. Absolutely not. It makes sense. It makes sense to run away? Caleb sat across from her. That's your solution? After everything we've built, everything we've fought for, you're just going to leave because some gossipy woman and a land-hungry neighbor are making noise? I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protection. I need partnership. That's what you promised when we made this deal. This deal is destroying us both. Can't you see that? Eleanor's careful control finally cracked. I came here thinking I could build something functional and stable. Instead, I've brought scandal, suspicion, and probably financial ruin. Everyone was right. I am too old, too complicated, too much trouble. I should have just gone back to Boston when I had the chance. Stop. It's true. I said stop. Caleb's voice cut through her spiral. You want to know what I see? I see someone who reorganized my disaster of an accounting system, who faced down a bank examiner and won, who negotiated better deals than I've managed in years, who helped build fences that actually work. You think any of that's trouble? That's competence. That's value. That's exactly what this ranch needed. And the marriage, the lies, the gossip, are complications we'll deal with together. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close. You don't get to quit on me now, Eleanor. We're partners. That means we fight together, or we don't fight at all. She was quiet for a long moment, tears she refused to shed making her eyes bright. I don't know how to fix this. Neither do I, but we'll figure it out. How can you be so certain? Because the alternative is giving up and letting Kemp win, and I'm too stubborn for that. Sarah used to say it was my worst quality. Refusing to quit, even when quitting, made sense. He finally did touch her hand, briefly, awkwardly. Turns out you're stubborn too. Maybe that's enough. Eleanor looked at their hands, his rough and calloused from ranch work, hers ink-stained from ledger keeping. And something in her expression shifted. Not hope, exactly, but maybe the absence of despair which was close enough for now. All right, she said. We keep fighting. But Caleb, we need to do something about the perception problem. We need to look more like an actual married couple and less like business partners sharing a house. How do we do that? I have absolutely no idea, but we have to try. The trying started small, awkward attempts at normalcy that felt anything but normal. Eleanor began sitting closer to Caleb at meals instead of maintaining careful distance. He started calling her by name in front of Miguel instead of the formal Mrs. Turner he'd defaulted to. Neither gesture felt natural, but they persisted anyway, hoping repetition would eventually breed authenticity. 2 weeks after the confrontation in the kitchen, Eleanor made a suggestion that caught Caleb completely off guard. We should go to the harvest dance, she said over breakfast. Miguel choked on his coffee. Caleb stared at her like she'd suggested they burn down the barn. The what? The harvest dance. Morrison mentioned it when I was in town yesterday. Annual event, apparently. Everyone attends. Couples dance, socialize, show off their children and crops, and whatever else people show off at these things. Eleanor spoke matter-of-factly, like proposing they attend a social gathering where everyone would scrutinize them wasn't terrifying. We should go. Why would we do that? Because married couples go to dances. Because hiding on the ranch only fuels speculation. Because if we want people to believe this marriage is real, we need to act like a real married couple in public, which means attending community events and not looking miserable about it. I don't dance, Caleb said. Neither do I, particularly well. But I assume we can manage to stand together and sway without causing a scandal. She poured more coffee, calm as discussing weather. Unless you have a better idea for improving public perception. He didn't. That was the problem. Short of actually falling in love, which seemed both impossible and beside the point, they needed to find ways to look married that didn't require them to fundamentally change who they were. When is it? Saturday, 3 days from now. Eleanor met his eyes. I know it's uncomfortable, but Kemp will be there, along with everyone else who's been gossiping. If we show up together, relaxed and comfortable with each other, it undermines his narrative that we're fraudulent. And if we show up looking exactly as uncomfortable as we actually are, then we confirm everything he's been saying, and we might as well hand him the ranch ourselves. She softened slightly. I'm not asking you to perform great romance, Caleb, just partnership. Just enough ease with each other that people stop looking for cracks. Miguel had been silent through this exchange, but now he spoke up. She's right. Town's still talking. You two showing up together, acting normal, that'd go a long way towards settling things down. Caleb felt trapped between bad options. Attend a dance he didn't want to go to with a woman he'd married for convenience, or stay home and let gossip continue unchallenged. Neither choice felt good, but one was clearly less terrible than the other. Fine. We'll go. Eleanor smiled, genuine relief crossing her face. Thank you. The next 3 days were strange. Eleanor seemed nervous in ways Caleb hadn't seen before, pulling out dresses and discarding them, asking his opinion on things he had no knowledge about. Did this color look too formal? Was this style appropriate for a ranch wife or too city refined? You're overthinking it, he finally said, watching her hold up a fourth option. I'm trying to strike a balance between respectable and approachable. Too fancy, and I look like I'm putting on airs. Too plain, and people will say you can't provide for me properly. People will say whatever they want, regardless of what you wear. That's not helpful. It's true, though. Caleb leaned against the doorframe of her room, still her room, though he'd started noticing small changes. Books she'd unpacked, a brush on the dresser, curtains she'd hemmed to fit properly. Signs of permanence that shouldn't matter, but somehow did. Wear whatever makes you comfortable. Anyone who judges you for it isn't worth worrying about. Eleanor lowered the dress, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When did you become wise about these things? I'm not wise. I just stopped caring what people think somewhere around the time Sarah died, and everyone had opinions about how I should grieve. How were you supposed to grieve? Quickly, quietly, and with minimal disruption to anyone else's comfort. He shrugged. Turned out I wasn't good at any of those things. Made people uncomfortable. Still do, probably. Good, Eleanor said firmly. Comfortable people rarely change anything. Saturday arrived too quickly. Caleb dressed in his one decent shirt, the one he wore to funerals and bank meetings, and tried not to think about how much he'd rather be anywhere else. Eleanor appeared wearing a deep blue dress that was simpler than her Boston clothes, but still carried an elegance that made her look both beautiful and completely out of his league. You look nice, he said, because it seemed like the thing a husband should say. You look uncomfortable, she replied. I'm uncomfortable. At least you're honest about it. She adjusted his collar, which he'd apparently buttoned wrong. Her fingers were gentle, efficient, and the casual intimacy of the gesture made him freeze. She noticed, stepped back quickly. Sorry, force of habit from helping my brother. It's fine. It wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine, but saying so wouldn't help. They rode to town as the wagon, both silent, both clearly dreading the next few hours. The dance was being held in the town hall, a large room that usually hosted county meetings and occasional court proceedings. By the time they arrived, it was already crowded with ranchers and their families, farmers from the outlying areas, townspeople eager for entertainment that didn't involve saloons or gambling. Music drifted through open doors, someone playing fiddle, another on harmonica, creating rough harmony that was more enthusiastic than skilled. People danced in the center of the room while others clustered around the edges, talking and watching and judging, always judging. Eleanor took Caleb's arm as they entered, and he felt her tension through the contact. She was scared, he realized. Terrified, actually, though hiding it well. This woman who'd faced down bank examiners and aggressive neighbors was frightened of a room full of dancing ranchers. "We can leave," he offered quietly. "No, we're here. We're doing this." She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked into the room like she owned it. Morrison saw them first, waved them over to where he stood with a group of other merchants. "Turner, Mrs. Turner, glad you could make it." The conversations around them didn't stop exactly, but they shifted. People watching from corners of their eyes, noting their arrival, cataloging how they stood together, how they moved, looking for evidence to support whatever theory they'd already decided was true. Eleanor handled it perfectly, smiling and making small talk, deflecting intrusive questions with practiced grace. She introduced herself to people she'd only met briefly, remembered names and details, asked polite questions about children and crops and businesses. Within 20 minutes, she'd charmed half the room just by being genuinely interested in their answers. Caleb watched her work and felt something close to admiration. This wasn't performance, or if it was rooted in real skill. She knew how to talk to people, how to make them feel heard, how to build connections that mattered. "Your wife's quite charming," Morrison observed. "She is," Caleb agreed, surprised to find he meant it. The dancing continued, couples swirling through increasingly chaotic patterns as the music sped up and the whiskey flowed more freely. Eleanor watched with barely concealed anxiety, and Caleb knew what was coming before she said it. "We should dance," she murmured. "I told you I don't dance. And I told you we need to look normal. Normal married couples dance together at harvest dances. People are already watching us stand on the sidelines like we're afraid to touch each other." She wasn't wrong. He could feel eyes on them, speculation building about why the newlyweds weren't dancing like everyone else. "I'll step on your feet," he warned. "I don't care. Just try not to injure me permanently." They moved to the floor as a slower song started. Small mercy in that, at least. Caleb put one hand on Eleanor's waist, took her other hand in his, and tried to remember basic dancing mechanics from a time when Sarah had insisted he learn. They moved awkwardly at first, out of rhythm with the music and each other, clearly uncomfortable with the proximity. But Eleanor was right that this was necessary, so Caleb forced himself to relax slightly, to stop thinking about the unfamiliarity of holding someone who wasn't Sarah. "You're actually not terrible at this," Eleanor said after they'd managed a full circuit without collision. "Low bar. I'm working with what I have." She smiled slightly and some of the tension eased. "See? We can do this. We can look like a normal couple for a few hours without the world ending." Across the room, Caleb caught sight of Harrison Kemp watching them with an expression that promised nothing good. He'd been talking to several well-dressed men Caleb didn't recognize, probably business associates from the city, given their expensive clothes and air of importance. "Don't look now, but Kemp's staring," Caleb said. "I know, I saw him when we came in." Eleanor's voice remained calm, but he felt her grip tighten slightly. "Let him stare. We're not doing anything wrong. Doesn't mean he won't try to make it look wrong. Then we make sure there's nothing to see." She looked up at him, and for a moment their faces were close enough that he could see flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "We're married, Caleb. Legally, legitimately married. Whatever his suspicions, he can't prove anything because there's nothing to prove. We just need to stay steady." The song ended and they separated with mutual relief. But they'd done it, danced together in public without looking like strangers forced into proximity. Small victory, but a victory nonetheless. They made it through another hour of socializing before Eleanor pulled him aside, exhaustion clear on her face despite her continued smile. "Can we leave soon? I'm running out of polite conversation and my feet hurt." "Absolutely." Caleb had been looking for an excuse to escape for the last 30 minutes. They were making their way toward the door when Kemp intercepted them, moving with the confidence of a man who'd been drinking just enough to lose basic social restraint. "Turner. Mrs. Turner." He nodded to Eleanor with exaggerated courtesy. "Lovely to see you both. Such a romantic story, your whirlwind courtship." "Mr. Kemp," Eleanor said coolly, "I was just telling my associates here about it." Kemp gestured to the well-dressed men flanking him. How you met at the train station after being abandoned by your intended groom and married Mr. Turner just days later. Quite the fairy tale. The men with Kemp looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. But Kemp continued, smile sharpening. Of course, some people might call it convenient timing. Bank approves restructuring. Suddenly there's a marriage to make the operation look more stable. But I'm sure that's just coincidence. Caleb felt anger flash hot, started to respond, but Eleanor spoke first. You're absolutely right, Mr. Kemp. It is convenient. Convenient that I found a man who values competence over youth, partnership over performance, and honest work over social approval. Convenient that Mr. Turner was willing to offer me opportunity when others saw only rejection. Convenient that we discovered we work well together and decided to formalize that partnership legally. She smiled, sharp and cold. And yes, convenient that our marriage strengthened our position with the bank. Though I fail to see how any of that's your concern, unless you're suggesting the bank made an error in judgment. I'm suggesting nothing, just making observations. Then observe this. We're married, the bank's satisfied, and the ranch is improving. Whatever you hope to accomplish by spreading gossip and innuendo has failed. We're still here, still working, and still not interested in selling you land that isn't for sale. Kemp's face reddened, but before he could respond, one of his associates stepped in. Perhaps we should get some air, Harrison. The room's quite warm. They departed with forced pleasantries, leaving Caleb and Eleanor standing in the middle of a harvest dance that had gone suddenly quiet, as people nearby strained to hear what had just happened. We should definitely leave now, Eleanor said quietly. They made their exit through a crowd that parted like water, everyone watching, everyone whispering, everyone forming opinions about what they'd witnessed. The ride home was silent, except for wagon wheels on dirt and horses breathing steady. Only when they were well away from town did Caleb speak. That was either brilliant or catastrophic. I can't tell which. Neither can I. Eleanor sounded exhausted. I lost my temper. That was stupid. I should have stayed calm, deflected graciously, not engaged directly. You defended us, both of us. I made a scene. You stood up to a bully who's been terrorizing me for months. That's not making a scene, that's having a spine. Eleanor looked at him, surprised. You're not angry? Why would I be angry? You said everything I've wanted to say to Kemp for years, but never had the words for. Caleb managed to smile. You're scary when you're defending something you care about. Remind me not to get on your bad side. Too late. You married me. You're permanently on whatever side I'm on now. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the failing buildings look almost beautiful. Miguel met them at the barn, took the horses without comment about how early they'd returned. Inside, Eleanor collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, pulled off her shoes with a groan of relief. I hate dances. Hate them. All that forced cheerfulness and pretending and politeness covering judgment. Then why did you insist we go? Because it was necessary. Because sometimes we have to do things we hate for reasons that matter. She rubbed her feet, wincing. Did it work? Do you think people bought it? Caleb thought about how they'd danced together, how she'd defended them to Kemp, how they'd moved through the room like actual partners instead of strangers. Some did. Some never will, no matter what we do. But yeah, I think it helped. Good. Then it was worth the blisters. She stood, padding barefoot toward the stairs. I'm going to bed. Wake me if the world ends. After she'd gone, Caleb sat alone in the kitchen thinking about the evening. About Eleanor's fierce defense of their marriage. About how natural her hand had felt in his while dancing. About the strange shift happening between them that he couldn't quite name. They were becoming something. Not the marriage they'd pretended to create, but something else. Actual partnership built through shared struggle and mutual respect. It wasn't love, nothing like what he'd had with Sarah, but it was real in its own right, solid, functional, maybe even good. The thought should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it just felt like truth. The next weeks brought changes that started small and accumulated into something significant. Eleanor proposed using the empty wing of the house, rooms that had been storage and dust since Caleb's father died, as a teaching space for local children whose families lived too far from any established school. There are at least 8 families within reasonable distance who have children getting no education, she explained, spreading maps on the kitchen table. I could teach them. Reading, writing, basic mathematics. Nothing fancy, but enough to give them foundation. You want to run a school? I want to be useful beyond bookkeeping, and these children need education, or they'll end up like their parents, capable enough but limited by lack of learning. Caleb studied the maps, the carefully marked locations of families with school-aged children. She'd done research, thought this through, wasn't just suggesting it on impulse. What do you need? Permission to use the space. Some basic supplies, slates, books, chalk, and help spreading word to the families. She looked at him directly. This isn't just about teaching. It's about embedding ourselves in the community, making the ranch valuable beyond cattle and land, giving people reason to support us instead of listening to Kemp's poison. Smart, practical, classic Eleanor, solving multiple problems with one solution. Do it, he said. She smiled, genuine pleasure that transformed her whole face. Thank you. Within 2 weeks, she'd cleaned and organized the unused rooms, acquired basic supplies through combination of purchase and donation, and spread word through Miguel and Morrison that she was offering free education to any child who could make the journey. The first day, 3 students arrived. A week later, 6. By the end of the month, 12 children ranging from age 6 to 14 showed up 3 days a week, eager and mostly attentive. Caleb would hear Eleanor teaching while he worked, her clear voice explaining multiplication or reading passages from borrowed books. She was good at it, patient but firm, refusing to accept careless work while encouraging genuine effort. Parents started showing up to drop off and collect their children, lingering to thank Eleanor, to discuss their kids' progress, to bring small gifts in appreciation. Fresh bread, preserved fruit, vegetables from gardens, once even a hand-knit shawl that Eleanor wore despite it being slightly too large. The school transformed the ranch's reputation. Suddenly, they weren't just the scandalous quick marriage everyone gossiped about. They were the couple providing education to children who otherwise had none. That mattered to people in ways gossip never could. Even Kemp's associates seemed to soften. One of them, a banker from Cheyenne named Phillips, stopped by ostensibly to check on his previous examination, but really to see the school. Impressive operation, Phillips said, watching Eleanor work with a group of younger students on letter formation. Community benefit like this reflects well on the ranch's stability. Mrs. Turner's idea, Caleb said. She saw a need and filled it. Your wife is remarkable, Mr. Turner. You're fortunate. After Phillips left, Caleb found Eleanor organizing papers in the teaching room. Bank examiner said you're remarkable. Bank examiner said it reflects well on our stability. Not the same thing. But she looked pleased anyway. Did he seem satisfied? More than satisfied. I think the school convinced him we're actually building something sustainable here. Eleanor set down her papers, leaned against the desk she'd claimed from storage. Are we? Building something sustainable? I think so. Ranch is stabilizing, debts are being paid on schedule, wolves haven't taken any more calves. The school's bringing community support. All measures say we're improving. That's not what I meant. She hesitated, choosing words carefully. I meant us. This arrangement. Is it sustainable long-term, or are we just delaying inevitable collapse? Caleb didn't have an easy answer to that. A month ago, I would have said it was temporary solution to immediate problem. Now, I don't know. Feels different. Different how? More real. Like we're not pretending anymore, we're just living. He shrugged, unable to articulate it better. Does that make sense? Unfortunately, yes. Eleanor looked out the window at students playing in the yard during break. I came here expecting to manage books and avoid scandal. Instead, I'm teaching children and defending our marriage to hostile neighbors, and somehow becoming invested in a ranch I have no historical connection to. You regret it? No, that's what worries me. She turned back to face him. I should regret it, should resent being trapped in marriage of convenience to a man I barely know. But I don't. I just keep finding more things to care about, more reasons to stay, more ways to make this feel like home. Before Caleb could respond, they heard a commotion from the yard. Both rushed outside to find Miguel helping a young boy who'd fallen and bloodied his knee. The child was crying, more from shock than pain, while other students clustered around anxiously. Eleanor took over immediately, kneeling in the dirt without concern for her dress, examining the injury with calm competence. You're all right, just scraped. Let's clean it up and you'll be good as new. She led the boy inside while Caleb dispersed the other students back to their play. When he returned to the teaching room, Eleanor had the boy sitting on a chair while she cleaned and bandaged his knee, talking to him gently about being more careful on the uneven ground. Watching her work, Caleb felt something shift in his chest. This was home. Not the buildings or the land, but this. Eleanor caring for a frightened child, students learning in rooms that had been empty, the ranch becoming center of community instead of isolated failure. They'd built this together, not through romance or grand gestures, but through work and determination and refusal to quit. That evening, after the last student had been collected and the teaching room tidied, Eleanor found Caleb repairing fence near the barn. Can I help? You know how to mend fence? No, but I can learn. She picked up wire, waiting for instruction. He showed her the technique, how to thread it through, where to twist, how much tension to apply. She was clumsy at first, pricking her fingers and getting frustrated, but she persisted until she'd completed a section that would hold. They worked in comfortable silence as the sun set, side by side fixing something that needed fixing. Not because they had to, but because it needed doing, and they were there to do it. This isn't what I expected when I left Boston, Eleanor said finally. What did you expect? I don't know. Romance, maybe, adventure, new beginning that felt dramatic and significant. She twisted wire, focused on the work. This is better, though. More honest. Better than romance? Better than the fantasy of it. Romance burns out, work endures, partnership lasts. She looked at him, face smudged with dirt, hands scratched from wire, completely beautiful in the fading light. I'd rather have this. Caleb felt something in his chest tighten, unfamiliar and startling. Not love. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way he'd loved Sarah. But something. Connection. Recognition. The beginning of whatever came next. Yeah, he said quietly. Me too. Winter came early that year, bringing snow in late October and temperatures that dropped below freezing before November. The school had to reduce days as travel became harder, but Eleanor adapted, teaching longer sessions less frequently, sending work home with students to practice between meetings. The ranch weathered the cold better than previous years. They had reserves now, hay stored properly, cattle healthy and fed, fences that kept predators out and livestock in. Eleanor's careful financial management meant they could afford necessary supplies without panic, could plan for spring without desperation. One evening in December, a blizzard hit hard and fast, trapping them inside for 3 days. The wind howled, snow piled against walls, visibility dropped to nothing. They huddled in the main room near the fire, conserving heat and resources. Miguel stayed in his cabin, safer than trying to reach the main house through the storm. So it was just Caleb and Eleanor, trapped together in a house that felt both too small and too large, with nothing to do but talk and wait for weather to break. Tell me about Sarah, Eleanor said the second evening, sitting across from him near the fire. Caleb looked up, surprised. They'd maintained careful silence about his first marriage, never discussing it directly. Why? Because she's part of this house, part of you, and I feel like I'm living in her shadow without knowing her. I'd rather know. Eleanor's expression was open, genuinely curious without jealousy or competition. If that's all right. So he told her about meeting Sarah at a county fair, about courting her despite her father's skepticism, about ranchers, about building this life together through early struggles and eventual stability, about her laugh, her competence, her ability to make hard decisions look easy, about watching her die slowly, helpless to stop it, and the guilt that still lived in him for being relieved when it finally ended because at least her suffering had stopped. Eleanor listened without interrupting, just absorbing, understanding in ways that didn't require words. She sounds remarkable, Eleanor said finally. She was. I'm not trying to replace her. I hope you know that. I do. And he did, surprisingly. You're nothing like her. That's not criticism, just fact. Good. Because trying to be someone else sounds exhausting. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter against cold that crept in despite the fire. Do you think she'd approve of this arrangement? Caleb thought about it honestly. I think she'd be practical about it. Sarah was always practical. If she could see the ranch stabilizing, the school helping kids, the community supporting us instead of judging us, yeah, I think she'd approve. Might even say she told me so, that I needed help whether I admitted it or not. Eleanor smiled at that. I would have liked her. She would have liked you too, respected you anyway, which is better. The storm broke on the fourth day, leaving behind snowdrifts that took hours to clear, and a landscape transformed into white silence. When Miguel finally made it to the main house, he found them working together to clear the porch, comfortable in ways they hadn't been months earlier. You two all right? He asked. Fine, Eleanor said. Although we've run out of coffee, which is tragic. I'll ride to town once the road's clear, assuming you trust me to handle supply run without supervision. Bring back coffee and you can handle whatever you want, Eleanor replied, making Miguel grin. That winter forged something between them that spring would build on. Not the romance people expected, but something maybe stronger. Respect earned through shared hardship, trust built through consistent reliability, comfort that came from familiarity rather than passion. By the time winter released its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, the ranch had transformed. Solvent, stable, no longer failing but actually functioning. The school had waiting list of families wanting their children included. The bank examiner's reports were positive. Even Kemp had gone quiet, his accusations losing power as evidence of their success mounted. One evening in March, as they reviewed the year's financial statements, Eleanor looked up with an expression Caleb had learned meant she was about to say something important. We did it, she said simply. Did what? Survived. Built something. Proved everyone wrong. She gestured at the ledgers, the neat columns showing income exceeding expenses, debts being paid, actual profit beginning to accumulate. This works. We work. Caleb looked at the numbers, at this woman who'd appeared in his life like a storm and stayed like a foundation, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. Yeah, he agreed. We do. Spring arrived with a violence that surprised them both. Floods from snowmelt, tornadic winds that tore shingles from the barn, early heat that made the cattle restless and the ground crack. Nature reminding them that survival was never guaranteed, that stability was always temporary, that the fight never really ended. Eleanor stood at the window watching storm clouds gather over the eastern ridge, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She'd been quiet all morning, distracted in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Something wrong? Caleb asked from the doorway. She didn't turn. Letter came from Boston yesterday, my sister-in-law. First contact since I left. He waited, knowing there was more. They want to visit, meet you, see what I've built here. Eleanor's voice carried no particular emotion, which meant she was working hard to suppress whatever she actually felt. She says the family's curious, that my brother regrets how things ended, how dismissive they were about my decision to come west. What do you want to do? I don't know. She finally turned to face him. Part of me wants to show them I was right, that leaving was the best decision I ever made, that this life is everything they said it couldn't be. But another part knows they'll see through it. See that we're not what we pretend to be. We're not pretending anymore, Caleb said. Haven't been for months. Aren't we? Eleanor crossed her arms, defensive. We still sleep in separate rooms, still maintain careful boundaries, still haven't. We're not a real marriage, Caleb. Not in any conventional sense, and my family will notice that immediately. It was true and not true simultaneously. They weren't conventional, but they were something. The past year had built connections that felt more solid than many traditional marriages Caleb had witnessed. But explaining that to Eleanor's Boston family, who would arrive with expectations about romance and propriety, seemed impossible. Tell them not to come, he suggested. I can't. That would confirm every criticism they made when I left. That I was running away, that I couldn't actually build anything sustainable, that I should have stayed where I belonged. She rubbed her temples, tired. They need to see this, see us, even if it's complicated. Then we show them the truth, the ranch, the school, the work we've done. Let that speak for itself. And our sleeping arrangements, our separate lives, are none of their business. Caleb moved closer, not quite touching, but present. Eleanor, we built something real here. Maybe it doesn't look like what they expect, but it works. It's ours. That's what matters. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Sometimes I forget you're just a simple rancher. You say things that sound almost philosophical. Sarah used to say I thought too much for my own good. Sarah was wrong about that. Eleanor managed a small smile. All right, I'll write back. Tell them they can visit in June, after the school term ends. That gives us 2 months to prepare. Prepare what? I have no idea. But 2 months seems like enough time to figure out how to explain our lives to people who won't understand them. The letter Eleanor sent was careful and correct, inviting her brother's family to visit while maintaining emotional distance that suggested she wasn't desperate for reconciliation. The response came quickly: enthusiastic acceptance, plans for a 3-week visit, excitement about seeing the frontier. 3 weeks? Eleanor said flatly, staring at the letter. They want to stay 3 weeks. Miguel, overhearing from where he was repairing a cabinet hinge, whistled low. That's a long time to maintain appearances. We're not maintaining appearances, Caleb said, though he understood the concern. We're just living our lives with house guests. House guests who will scrutinize everything we do, Eleanor countered. My sister-in-law is lovely, but observant. She'll notice that we don't. She trailed off, unable to articulate what they didn't do without making it sound worse than it was. The preparations consumed the next weeks. Eleanor cleaned rooms that were already clean, organized things that were already organized, fretted about details that probably didn't matter. Caleb and Miguel made repairs to the house that had been postponed, fixing that persistent leak in the parlor, replacing cracked windows, painting trim that had weathered to gray. The school term ended with a small celebration. Parents brought food, children performed recitations they'd learned. Eleanor gave each student a book to keep over summer, used copies she'd acquired through careful shopping and occasional donation, but books nonetheless. You've done something remarkable here, one mother said, gripping Eleanor's hands. My daughter can read now, actually read. That's because of you. After everyone left, Eleanor stood in the empty teaching room, looking at the chairs arranged in rows, the slate boards wiped clean, the books shelved neatly. Caleb found her there as the sun was setting. Proud of yourself? He asked. Surprised, mostly. I didn't expect teaching to feel like this. Like what? Like mattering. Like the work I do actually changes things in ways I can see. She turned to face him. In Boston, I managed a household. Important work, but invisible. Here, I can point to children who can read because I taught them. That's different. You could keep doing it. School doesn't have to be just for one term. I know, I plan to. Eleanor walked to the window, looking out at land that had become familiar. This place has gotten under my skin, Caleb. I didn't expect that either. Her family arrived on a Tuesday in early June, stepping off the train at Clearwater Station in clothes too fine for Wyoming dust and expressions mixing curiosity with barely concealed judgment. Eleanor's brother Robert was 45, prosperous looking, with the soft hands of a man whose hardest work involved signing papers. His wife Caroline was younger, pretty in a delicate way that suggested she'd never missed a meal or worried about money. Their 2 children, a boy of 12 and a girl of 9, looked around the station like they'd arrived on the moon. Eleanor stood beside Caleb on the platform, spine straight, face carefully neutral. He could feel tension radiating off her in waves. Eleanor, Robert said, embracing his sister with awkwardness that suggested they'd never been physically affectionate. You look well. Different, but well. Hard work will do that. Eleanor turned to Caroline. Thank you for coming. It's a long journey. We were curious, Caroline said, meaning judgmental but wrapping it in politeness. Your letters made this place sound almost civilized. It is civilized, just differently than Boston. Eleanor gestured to Caleb. This is my husband, Caleb Turner. Caleb, my brother Robert, his wife Caroline, and their children Henry and Margaret. Handshakes were exchanged, assessments made. Caleb could see Robert cataloging everything. Caleb's work-worn clothes, his calloused hands, the weathered face of someone who spent life outdoors, finding him lacking compared to whatever Robert thought his sister deserved. The ride to the ranch was stilted, Caroline asking questions that sounded polite but carried barbs. How many cattle did they run? What were the financial prospects? Had Eleanor adjusted to such rustic conditions? Eleanor answered with practiced patience, revealing nothing substantive while appearing cooperative. Caleb watched her navigate her family's subtle hostility and felt something protective stir. These people had dismissed her, pushed her out, and now arrived expecting to find her failing so they could feel vindicated in their judgment. The ranch itself clearly surprised them. Robert had obviously expected something more desperate, tumble-down buildings and obvious poverty. Instead, he found a functional operation with well-maintained structures, healthy livestock, and signs of prosperity that didn't match his assumptions. "Quite impressive," he said, in a tone suggesting he wished it wasn't. Eleanor showed them to their rooms. The teaching space temporarily converted to guest quarters. Caroline inspected everything with barely concealed disdain. But the children seemed genuinely excited about the adventure of staying on a ranch. That evening, Eleanor prepared dinner with intensity that suggested she was cooking to prove something. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden she'd cultivated, dessert made from preserved fruit. Nothing fancy by Boston standards, probably, but honest food prepared with care. "You've become quite domestic," Caroline observed, in a way that made domesticity sound like failure. "I've become practical," Eleanor corrected. "Different skill set than managing servants. Still, it must be difficult. The isolation, the lack of cultural opportunities, the limited society." Caroline's eyes moved between Eleanor and Caleb, searching for cracks. "How do you fill your days?" "Teaching, mostly. I run a school for local children 3 days a week during term." That surprised Robert. "A school? Here? Why not here? Children need education regardless of geography." Eleanor's voice carried an edge. "I teach 15 students ranging from age 6 to 14, reading, writing, mathematics, some history, and science. Basic foundation for futures that shouldn't be limited by their parents' circumstances." "How progressive," Caroline said, making progress sound vaguely scandalous. Caleb had remained mostly silent through dinner, but now he spoke. "Your sister's school is one of the most valuable things in this community. Families drive hours to bring their children here. She's given opportunity where none existed before." Robert looked at him with surprise, like he'd forgotten Caleb could speak. "I'm sure it's very charitable, though it seems like significant work for no compensation." "Not everything valuable can be measured in dollars," Eleanor said sharply. The tension hung heavy until young Henry, bored with adult conversation, asked if he could see the horses. Caleb escaped gratefully, showing both children the barn, while the adults continued whatever battle they were fighting over dessert. "Are those real longhorns?" Henry asked, staring at the cattle visible through the barn doors. "They are. Ornery as hell, but good for this climate." Margaret gasped. "You said a bad word." "I did, sorry. Ornery as heck." The children were easier than their parents, genuinely curious, unencumbered by judgment or expectation. Caleb showed them how to brush horses, let them collect eggs from the chickens, explained ranch operations in terms they could understand. For an hour, he forgot about the discomfort of house guests and just enjoyed their uncomplicated enthusiasm. When he returned to the house, he found Eleanor and Caroline alone in the parlor, Robert having retired early with what he claimed was a headache. "Your husband seems competent," Caroline was saying, "though I confess I still don't understand the hasty marriage. You knew each other barely a week before wedding?" "We knew each other well enough," Eleanor said. "Did you? Or were you just desperate after that unfortunate business at the station?" Caroline's voice dripped false sympathy. "It's understandable, Eleanor. Rejection at your age must have been devastating. Anyone might make impulsive decisions under those circumstances." Caleb saw Eleanor's face go carefully blank, the expression she wore when suppressing fury. "My decision to marry Caleb had nothing to do with desperation and everything to do with recognizing opportunity," Eleanor said evenly. "We're partners. We built this ranch together, built the school together, built a life that works for us. That's more than many conventional marriages can claim." "Partners?" Caroline repeated. "How modern, though I notice you sleep in separate rooms." Ice settled in Caleb's chest. Of course Caroline had noticed. She'd probably been cataloging evidence since arrival. "Our sleeping arrangements are our business," Eleanor said, voice dropping to dangerous quiet. "Of course. I'm just concerned. Marriage is more than partnership, Eleanor. It's intimacy, companionship, love. Do you have that here truly? Or are you just making the best of a difficult situation?" Eleanor stood abruptly. "I'm tired. We can continue this conversation tomorrow when you're less interested in finding fault with every aspect of my life." She left the room without waiting for response. Caleb met Caroline's eyes across the space, saw calculation there, and decided he'd had enough diplomacy for one day. "Mrs. Thornton," he said quietly, I don't know what you came here expecting to find. Maybe evidence that Eleanor made a mistake. Proof that she should have stayed in Boston, accepting whatever scraps of purpose you allowed her. But you're not going to find that. She's thriving here, building things, teaching children, making actual difference in people's lives. If you can't see that, can't be happy for her, then you're welcome to leave early. Caroline's face reddened. How dare you? I dare because she's my wife and this is my home, and you're a guest who's forgotten how to act like one. You want to judge us? Fine. Judge. But do it silently or not at all, because I'm not going to watch you tear down a woman who's worked harder than you've probably worked in your entire life. He left Caroline sitting in stunned silence and went to find Eleanor. She was in her room, sitting on the bed, staring at nothing. I heard, she said before he could speak. Walls are thin. I shouldn't have said that to your sister-in-law. You should have said worse. Eleanor's voice was tight. She came here to prove I failed, to confirm that leaving Boston was foolish, that I'm living some desperate charade. And the worst part is, she's not entirely wrong. We are sleeping in separate rooms. We're not intimate. We're exactly what she accused us of being, partners pretending to be more. Caleb sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Are we pretending? What? Are we pretending, or have we actually built something real that just doesn't look like what they expect? He turned to face her. Eleanor, I don't know what love looks like anymore. Lost that frame of reference when Sarah died. But I know what partnership looks like, what respect looks like, what trust looks like, and we have those things. Maybe that's not romance, but it's not pretending either. Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I don't want to be a disappointment. To them or to yourself? Both, neither. I don't know anymore. She wiped her eyes roughly. I thought I was past caring what they thought. Turns out I'm not as evolved as I believed. Join the club. I spent months caring what the bank thought, what Kemp thought, what everyone thought. Drove me halfway crazy. Caleb shifted closer. But here's what I learned. Other people's opinions don't change reality. Either we built something good here, or we didn't. Their judgment doesn't affect which one is true. And which one do you think is true? He considered the question seriously. I think we built something better than good. I think we took two broken situations and made them work together. I think you're the best partner I could have asked for, even if I didn't know I was asking. And I think your family can either accept that or not, but it doesn't change what we know. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. When did you become wise about people? Probably around the time you became essential instead of hired help. He smiled slightly. We're not pretending, Eleanor. We're just being honest about what we have instead of apologizing for what we don't. She leaned against his shoulder, first time she'd initiated physical contact that wasn't strictly practical. Thank you. For defending me to Caroline, for seeing value in what we've built, for not giving up on this strange arrangement. Same to you. He let his head rest against hers, comfortable in ways that would have been impossible months ago. We've got 2 more weeks with them. Think we can survive it? If we survived bank examiners and wolves and Kemp, we can survive my judgmental family. Eleanor sat up, resolve settling over her features. And maybe it's time to stop apologizing for what we are. They want conventional marriage? Too bad. This is what we have, and it works. The next 2 weeks tested that resolve repeatedly. Robert asked invasive questions about finances, clearly trying to determine if Caleb was taking advantage of his sister. Caroline made pointed comments about Eleanor's appearance, her domestic skills, her choice to settle for ranch life. The children were pleasant enough, but even they sometimes looked at Eleanor with confusion, wondering why their aunt seemed so different from the woman they'd known in Boston. But something had shifted after that conversation in Eleanor's room. They stopped trying to appear as something they weren't and just existed as themselves. Partners who respected each other, worked together, had built something functional, if unconventional. Slowly, surprisingly, Robert began to soften. He spent days working alongside Caleb, actual physical labor that left him exhausted but seemingly satisfied. One evening, covered in dust and sweat from helping repair a fence section, he admitted something unexpected. I didn't understand what Eleanor was doing here, Robert said, accepting water Caleb offered. Thought she was running away, making foolish decisions out of hurt pride. But watching her with those students, seeing how the community responds to her, I was wrong. Caleb drank his own water, letting Robert work through whatever he needed to say. She was invisible in Boston. I didn't realize it at the time, but she was. Just the unmarried sister, the household manager, the person we relied on without valuing. Here, she matters, actually matters to people beyond family obligation. Robert looked at Caleb directly. You see that in her, don't you? The value. Every day, Caleb said honestly. Then I owe you an apology. And her one too, though I don't know if she'll accept it. Try anyway. She needs to hear it. That evening, after the children were in bed, Robert asked Eleanor to walk with him. Caleb watched them from the porch, two silhouettes against the sunset, having whatever conversation they needed to have. When they returned, Eleanor's eyes were red, but her expression was peaceful. We talked, she said simply. Good talk? Good enough. He apologized. Actually apologized, not the half-hearted kind. Said he was wrong about me leaving, wrong about this life, wrong about you. She sat beside Caleb on the porch steps. Said I seem happier here than I ever was in Boston. Are you? Eleanor considered the question seriously. Yes. Surprisingly, fundamentally yes. I didn't expect that when I came here. Expected survival, maybe functionality, not actual happiness. But it's here anyway. Built from broken pieces, Caleb observed. Those are sometimes the strongest kind. She leaned back, looking at stars emerging in the darkening sky. Caroline's still skeptical. I don't think she'll ever fully understand what we have, but Robert gets it now. That's enough. The remaining week of the visit was easier. Robert stopped interrogating and started genuinely participating in ranch life. Caroline remained distant, but less actively hostile. The children discovered they loved feeding chickens and collecting eggs, begging to stay longer when departure approached. On their last evening, Eleanor prepared a farewell dinner. Nothing elaborate, just good food shared around the table they'd eaten at so many times before. Caleb told stories about early ranch days. Eleanor shared student successes. Even Caroline contributed a few less barbed observations. Will you visit us in Boston? Margaret asked Eleanor. We have a piano. I could play for you. Maybe someday, Eleanor said gently, but this is my home now. You're always welcome to visit here. After dinner, while Eleanor was putting the children to bed, Robert approached Caleb with an envelope. What's this? Something I should have offered when Eleanor first wrote about marrying you. Robert's expression was serious. It's money, not charity. An investment in the ranch. Consider it Eleanor's late dowry, if you need a name for it. Use it for improvements, expansion, whatever you need. Caleb started to refuse, but Robert stopped him. I know you're proud. Know you've built this without help. But accept this anyway. Not for you, for Eleanor. So she knows her family supports what she's built here, that we value her choices even if we don't fully understand them. Caleb looked at the envelope, then at Robert. I'll discuss it with Eleanor. Whatever we decide together. As it should be. Robert extended his hand. Take care of my sister, Turner. She deserves good things. I know. I'll do my best. The family departed the next morning, Caroline still skeptical but quiet about it. Robert genuinely regretful the visit was ending, the children promising to write about their adventures. After the train pulled away, Eleanor and Caleb stood on the platform watching dust settle. That was exhausting, Eleanor said. Completely. But good. Surprisingly good. She turned to him. Robert gave you money, didn't he? How did you know? Because he pulled me aside last night and said he was going to, asked if I'd be offended. Eleanor smiled slightly. I told him to give it to you, that you'd handle it properly. Did I presume too much? No, you presumed exactly right. Caleb showed her the envelope. He said it's an investment, your late dowry. That's generous of him. Probably guilt-motivated, but generous nonetheless. Eleanor considered. We should use it for the school. Expand it properly. Maybe hire another teacher for when enrollment grows. Build something permanent. That's what I was thinking too. They stood together on the empty platform, partners in fact and practice if not conventional romance, and Caleb felt something click into place. Not completion, they were still works in progress individually and together, but rightness. This was where they belonged, doing this work, building this life. The summer that followed was busy in the best way. They used Robert's investment to expand the school, adding a second room and purchasing real desks instead of repurposed furniture. Eleanor advertised for an assistant teacher, found a young woman from Cheyenne eager for the position, and together they planned a more comprehensive curriculum for the fall term. The ranch prospered. Cattle prices rose, their herd was healthy, and with proper financial management, they were actually accumulating savings instead of just avoiding debt. Caleb hired 2 additional ranch hands to help Miguel, allowing them to expand operations without sacrificing quality. One evening, in late August, Eleanor was working on a quilt in the parlor, pieces of fabric from various sources, some from old clothes, some donated by students' families, creating a patchwork history of their year together. Caleb sat nearby reading reports from the assistant teacher about curriculum proposals, occasionally asking Eleanor's opinion. "We should travel," Eleanor said suddenly. Caleb looked up. "Where?" "Anywhere. Cheyenne, maybe, or Denver. See something beyond this ranch and Clearwater Station." She set down her sewing. "We've been here a full year, working constantly, never taking time for ourselves. We should change that." "You want a honeymoon?" He meant it teasingly, but Eleanor's expression turned thoughtful. "Not a honeymoon exactly, but maybe a trip, together. Not for business or obligation, just for the experience." She met his eyes. "Would that be strange?" "Probably. But we've never cared much about strange." Caleb set aside his papers. "All right, let's plan a trip. Where do you want to go?" They settled on Denver, big enough to be interesting, close enough to be practical. Miguel could manage the ranch for a week, the school was between terms, and they could use the time to purchase supplies unavailable in Clearwater. But really, they both knew it was about something else. About choosing to spend time together not because they had to, but because they wanted to. About seeing if what they'd built on the ranch could exist in different contexts. The trip to Denver was an education in how much they'd changed. They traveled together comfortably, shared hotel rooms without awkwardness, explored the city like actual partners. Eleanor dragged Caleb to museums and bookshops, and he introduced her to better restaurants than Wyoming offered. One evening, walking back to their hotel after dinner, Eleanor slipped her hand into his, just held it, natural and unconsidered, like they'd been doing it for years instead of this being the first time. Caleb looked at their joined hands, surprised by how right it felt. "Too much?" Eleanor asked, noticing his expression. "No, just different." He squeezed her hand gently. "Good, different." They continued walking in comfortable silence. 2 people who'd married out of necessity, learning they might actually like each other beyond practical partnership. That night, sitting on the hotel balcony watching Denver's streets slowly empty, Eleanor brought up the subject they'd been dancing around for months. "Do you think we'll ever—" She trailed off, but Caleb knew what she was asking. "Be a real marriage? In all the ways we're not currently?" "Yes." He thought about it honestly. "I don't know. Part of me thinks we're already real in the ways that matter. But another part knows we're missing something that most marriages have. Romance," Eleanor supplied. "Connection, maybe. Intimacy beyond partnership." Caleb turned to face her. "Does that bother you?" "Sometimes. Not because I need romance. I've never been particularly romantic. But because I wonder if we're cheating ourselves out of something by being so careful with each other." Eleanor looked at him directly. "I care about you, Caleb, more than I expected to, more than partnership requires, and I don't know what to do with that." His heart did something complicated in his chest. "I care about you too. You're not just my partner or my wife on paper. You're more. I just don't have words for what more means yet." "We don't need words." Eleanor reached for his hand again. "We just need to stop being so afraid of whatever this is becoming." "I'm not afraid," Caleb said, realizing as he spoke that it was true. "Just careful. Didn't want to assume you wanted something you didn't. I want more than we have. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I want to find out." She smiled, nervous but genuine. "Is that all right?" Instead of answering with words, Caleb leaned forward and kissed her. Gentle, tentative, giving her space to pull away if this wasn't what she meant. She didn't pull away. Instead, she kissed him back, and it felt like something unlocking, not passion exactly, but possibility. The beginning of whatever came next for 2 people who'd been carefully circling each other for a year. When they separated, Eleanor was smiling. "That was good." Just good? Very good. Excellent, even. She laughed, sounding young and free. We're terrible at this, aren't we? A year married and our first kiss happens in a Denver hotel. We do everything backwards. Why should this be different? They stayed on that balcony talking until early morning, not about profound things, but about everything and nothing. Childhood memories, favorite books, small hopes and larger dreams, learning each other beyond the practical partnership they'd maintained. By the time they returned to Wyoming, something fundamental had shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously to outside observers, but real nonetheless. They still kept separate rooms, still maintained boundaries, but the distance had decreased. Small touches became common. Shared glances carried meaning. The careful politeness transformed into genuine affection. Fall arrived with this new school term. Enrollment had doubled. Word spreading about the quality of education Eleanor and her assistant provided. They taught 30 students now, requiring both rooms and careful scheduling. Parents continued showing gratitude through contributions of supplies, labor, and occasional monetary donations that Eleanor carefully recorded and used to improve the school further. One October afternoon, Caleb found Eleanor in the teaching room after students had left, staring at a letter with an expression he couldn't read. What is it? Letter from the Territorial Education Board. They heard about our school. She handed him the letter. They want to make it official, provide funding, certified curriculum, make it a recognized institution instead of informal arrangement. Caleb read the letter, impressed. This is good, right? It's everything I didn't know I wanted. Eleanor's voice was thick with emotion. Official recognition, real funding, the ability to hire more teachers, expand enrollment, maybe even build a separate school building. It's real, Caleb. What we started is becoming something real. He pulled her close, let her lean against him while she processed this validation of work she'd poured herself into. You did this. You built something that matters. We did this, she corrected. None of it happens without the ranch being stable, without you supporting the idea, without this community we built together. The territorial recognition changed everything and nothing. The school grew, moved into its own building constructed with community labor and territorial funds. Eleanor hired 2 more teachers, developed comprehensive curriculum, created something that would outlast them both. The ranch continued prospering. 3 years after that desperate morning when Eleanor sat alone on a train platform, they owned their land outright, ran profitable cattle operations, and had established themselves as respected community members. Harrison Kemp made one final attempt to cause trouble, spreading rumors about financial impropriety. But the community that had once been susceptible to his poison now rallied around Eleanor and Caleb. The bank laughed off Kemp's accusations. Morrison and other merchants publicly supported them. Even Judge Warren, who'd married them in that hasty courthouse ceremony, wrote a letter defending their character. Kemp left Wyoming shortly after, moving to Montana, where presumably he found new victims to torment. No one missed him. On a warm spring evening 4 years after their marriage, Caleb found Eleanor sitting on the porch watching sunset paint the sky impossible colors. She'd been doing that more lately, pausing to appreciate moments instead of constantly working. "Room for one more?" he asked. She patted the space beside her. "Always." He sat, and she immediately leaned against him. Easy familiarity that had developed over years of learning each other. They'd moved into the same bedroom 2 years earlier, not with drama or grand gesture, but with quiet acknowledgement that maintaining separate spaces had become silly. Their marriage had become real in all the ways it hadn't been initially, built slowly through choice rather than circumstance. "Miguel's talking about getting married," Eleanor said. "That woman from Morrison's store says he's tired of being alone." "Good for him. She's practical. He likes practical. Wonder if they'll do it our way. Marry first, fall in love later." Eleanor smiled. "Seems to have worked for us." "Did we fall in love?" Caleb asked. "Or did we just build something so solid it became love without us noticing?" "Does it matter?" He thought about it. "No, I suppose it doesn't." They sat in comfortable silence, watching darkness settle. 2 people who'd been broken finding wholeness, not in being fixed, but in functioning together despite remaining cracks. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Taking a chance on a stranger at a train station?" "Not even once." Caleb kissed her temple. "You?" "I regret that it took public humiliation and cross-country travel to get here. But the actual marriage? Being here with you? Building this life? Never." She turned to look at him. We proved them all wrong, you know. Everyone who said it was too fast, too convenient, too practical to last. We built something real from completely unromantic beginnings. Maybe that's the secret, Caleb suggested. Starting with honesty about what it is instead of pretending it's what it's not. Less room for disappointment when you're not chasing fairy tales. Practical even about love, very on brand for us. They laughed together, and Caleb thought about the journey from that first desperate meeting to this moment of genuine contentment. About how the worst moments of their lives had led to the best. About how being broken open had allowed them to become whole in ways they'd never expected. Eleanor had created a quilt from their first year together, all those scraps and pieces stitched into coherent whole. It hung in their bedroom now, reminder of how disconnected fragments could become something beautiful with patience and care. Their marriage was like that quilt, pieces that shouldn't work together, stitched with necessity and determination, creating warmth and covering and comfort that lasted. Not perfect, never perfect, but functional and real and theirs. And sometimes, Caleb had learned, that was better than any fairy tale romance could ever be. The school bell rang in the distance, someone's child playing with it in the yard. Eleanor smiled at the sound. Life is strange, she observed. How so? A year ago, I was rejected, abandoned, considered too old and too difficult for conventional marriage. Now I'm running a territorial school, managing a prosperous ranch, and married to a man who actually values what I contribute. She shook her head. If someone had told me this is where that train platform humiliation would lead, I never would have believed them. Sometimes the worst moments are just doorways to better ones, Caleb said. You just have to be brave enough to walk through instead of turning back. When did you become a philosopher? Around the time you became essential instead of convenient. Eleanor laughed, kissed him soundly, and stood. Come on, let's go inside. I want to show you the curriculum proposals for next term. I think you'll appreciate the mathematics section. You want to show me math homework? That's your idea of evening entertainment? It's our school, our work, our life together. She extended her hand. Come on, partner, we've got planning to do. He took her hand, let her pull him up, and followed her inside. Through the door they'd both entered as strangers, into the home they'd built through stubbornness and sweat and refusal to quit. Behind them, the Wyoming sunset painted the sky in colors that didn't exist in Boston. Ahead, lamps glowed warm in windows of a house that had been dying and now thrived. And between those 2 points, past and future, brokenness and healing, convenient arrangement and genuine love, stood 2 people who'd learned that sometimes the best things in life weren't the ones you planned for. They were the ones you built from nothing when everything else had fallen apart.